563, orders for the FY19 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, annual appropriations for the school department, appropriation for other post-employment benefits, appropriation for certain transportation and public realm improvements, and appropriation for certain park improvements. And dockets 0564 and 0565, capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I'd like to remind folks that this is a public hearing. It is being broadcast and recorded on RCN Channel 82, Comcast 8, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. I ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. At the conclusion of the departmental presentation and questions from my colleagues, we will take public testimony. There are sign-in sheets to my left by the door. We ask that you state your name, affiliation, residence, and please mark the box if you do wish to testify. There are several other ways to provide public testimony. One is you can email the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov, by regular mail at City Hall, Boston City Hall, 1 City Hall Plaza, Boston 02201, care of the Committee on Ways and Means. And on June 5th, we will have a minimum 4-hour session on June 5th between the hours of 2 to 6, and only take public testimony on any aspect of the FY19 budget. I'd like to introduce folks in what I think is the order they arrived. Councilor Michael Flaherty to my left, Councilor Tim McCarthy to my immediate right, to my left, immediate left, Councilor Nisa Sabi George, to my far left, Councilor Ed Flynn, to my right, Councilor Lydia Edwards, and Councilor Kim Janey. Thank you. I want to welcome you all. Director Golden, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Vice Chairman McCarthy, and through you to the members of the Council. My name is Brian Golden, and I'm the Director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Thanks for allowing myself and staff the opportunity to once again discuss the work of our agency with you. I'm joined today to my left by Michelle Goldberg, the Budget and Procurement Manager for the agency, Trin Nguyen, Director of the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, and Ed O'Donnell, the Director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency's Real Estate Division. Our agency is charged with growing Boston's tax base, cultivating the city's private jobs market, training our workforce, working with the community to plan the future of our neighborhoods, charting the course for sustainable development and resilient building construction, advocating for multimodal transportation, responding to the city's changing population, producing insightful research on our city through our research division, and ensuring that Boston retains its distinctive character and high quality of life. The Boston Planning and Development Agency works closely with the city's Department of Neighborhood Development on affordable housing through our inclusionary development policy, our so-called IDP policy, which you will no doubt hear referenced multiple times this afternoon. We also work with the assessing department of the city on Chapter 121A in lieu of tax arrangements. We also work with the Boston Transportation Department, the Public Works Department, and the Parks Departments on the impacts of development in the city's neighborhoods. This past year marked another productive year across the functions of the BPDA. We continued our work to create robust economic activity throughout the city of Boston while better engaging and collaborating with the communities that we all serve. We experienced another very strong year for real estate development, construction, and overall economic activity. We are welcoming both new residents at a significant pace and new employers who see the tremendous benefits of choosing Boston as their home. Fueled by Boston's growing population, we are in the midst of the biggest building boom in Boston's history. That's been the case for the past several years. New development is moving forward and creating local economic development and jobs in every neighborhood in the city. We approved over 11.3 million square feet of new development in calendar year 2017 and nearly 6,000 new residential units, helping us make significant progress towards reaching Mayor Walsh's goal to create 53,000 new housing units by 2030 to house our growing population. In 2017, Boston set a new record for units permitted in Boston in 1 year, with 5,379 housing permits issued. Of the homes we've permitted since 2014, over 19% are income restricted for low, moderate, and income families. And 22% are market rate units that are affordable to middle income families. Since 2014, using IDP and linkage funds generated through large project review at the agency, 4,322 affordable units have been completed or are under construction, and an additional 1,466 affordable units have been preserved through this activity. We harnessed the strong market to keep Boston the national leader in affordable housing. 1 out of 5 housing units are income restricted. No major city we know of comes close to that figure. Development in Boston is supporting the growth of the city's tax base, allowing for critical funding for city services like our schools, streets, parks, and public safety. This year, Mayor Walsh's fiscal year 19 budget, which is before you right now, increased by $137 million, or 4.3% over the fiscal year 2018 budget. Of the $137 million in new revenue, $118 million comes from property tax growth, and $77 million of that comes from brand new development being taxed for the first time. Development is also creating thousands of new jobs. Since 2014, projects approved by the BPDA board have created 41,068 construction jobs and 38,600 permanent jobs. Transformational projects are moving forward. Following a comprehensive process where we've worked with you over the past 3 years to ensure that we have maximized revenue flowing to the residents of Boston, last week, the 115 Federal Street Winthrop Square project was approved by the BPDA board. This paves the way for a $163 million payment to the City of Boston that will be invested in affordable housing and open space. I'm happy to report that due to several reforms made over the past few years to improve the way we operate, the BPDA is seeing favorable trends in both revenue and operating expenses. This is further explained in detail in the questionnaire and responses to that questionnaire that we forwarded for your attention. It deals with the fiscal year 2018 third quarter update, which we've just completed. We completed our 10-year capital improvement plan at the agency, which identifies and prioritizes long-term investments and infrastructure projects to support future economic growth in the Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park, the Charlestown Navy Yard, Long Wharf, the China Trade Building at 2 Boylston Street, and the BPDA's other physical assets. We are now working to establish a strategic and sustainable funding plan to support this critical work on our physical infrastructure. In addition, our Administration and Finance Department released the first of its kind budget book to accompany the fiscal year 18 budget for the agency. This is available on our website to anybody who's interested, and we hope that the City Council has found this document to be informative. In closing, we remain committed to continuing to evolve into an agency that better serves our community and creates an inclusive Boston for all. I'll now turn the presentation over to Trin Nguyen from our Office of Workforce Development. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Golden. Good afternoon, Chairman Siomo, who is also the Neighborhoods Jobs Trust trustee member. Thank you for your service, and all of the work that will be stated here would be part of your accomplishments as well. So thank you for your service. Also, thank you to Vice Chairman McCarthy and respected council members here today. My name is Trin Nguyen, and I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, and I have been the Director under Mayor Walsh since January of 2014. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our work with you. As many of you know, OWD is also known as Office of Workforce Development. Our mission is to be an innovative public agency that promotes economic resilience to ensure the full participation of all Boston residents in the city's economic vitality and future. OWD support and creates policies, programs, and grants that promote workforce development through education, job training, apprenticeships, career services, financial coaching, credit building, career pathways, adult basic education, English for learners, English as a second language learners initiatives, youth employment services, and the like. To carry out these efforts, OWD has an annual program operation and grant budget of $18 million, and about 80% of this total is from grants, and the remaining 20% comes from the support of the BPDA. Specifically, as the largest workforce development funder in the city, out of this total annual budget, we distribute over $14 million to 65 job training nonprofit community partners, including 2 career centers that serve 15,000 job seekers to develop resume writing, networking, interviewing skills, and job search skills, and serving 700 regional employers, connecting them to these job seekers. Economic equity and inclusion is one of Mayor Walsh's top priority, which is why in the last 4.5 years, our team is laser focused on job quality, career pathways, meaningful youth employment, and financial capability, all with measurable outcomes. We are seeing some positive results. For example, among clients of Boston's one-stop career centers, 59% of them obtain employment within the first quarter exit, earning an average wage of $21.36 per hour. Also, upon job placements, graduates of training programs specifically funded by the Neighborhoods Jobs Trust that comes from linkage. We grant all of the grants that we give to nonprofits, the graduates earn an average wage of $15.23 per hour, with 52% of them earning benefits as well. Also, students in our tuition-free community college plan, which is funded by developer fees through linkage, achieved a higher first-year retention rate, which is 65%. This is higher than the state's or the national averages for community college retention rates and completion. Most of these students are low-income and students of color. I'm also happy to report that Madison Park Technical Vocational High School has the highest student participation rate for this tuition-free community college program. Youth and adult workers who participated in our city-sponsored credit building workshops and one-on-one financial coaching showed improved credit histories, higher credit scores, and less delinquency than a control group when they're not receiving the financial capability services that's funded through our programs. With additional support from the BPDA earlier this year, we were able to integrate these best practices for scale and optimal impact. For example, we launched 2 new citywide initiatives. One is the Boston Builds Credit, a first in the nation, a citywide credit building initiative which helps 25,000 Boston residents attain a credit score of 660 or higher by the year 2025 through financial education and one-on-one financial coaching throughout the city. And the second initiative is Boston Hires, which is a collaborative campaign to place 20,000 unemployed or underemployed residents in good jobs by 2022. So far, 30-plus nonprofit employers and organizations have signed up to help place residents in jobs that pay at least a living wage, which is $14.41 an hour, with at least half of these jobs includes employer-sponsored benefits. The work and highlights mentioned here by no means imply that we are here to celebrate. This is just the beginning, and there's much more work to do. We realize this, and we're committed to working even harder. In closing, I want to thank the BPDA's leadership and their financial support, Mayor Walsh and his administration, council members, and hundreds of community partners for shaping and executing our agenda, one that is inclusive of all Bostonians. As Director Golden have stated, that there are a lot of economic prosperity throughout the city of Boston. We wouldn't be a great city if we did not include everyone. And our work really helps push that equity agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. And I have the privilege of serving with you, and you brought an unbelievable new perspective and fresh energy to that, that fund, and we're doing some great things. I want to thank you for that. I'd also like to recognize several of my colleagues joined us at the beginning of the presentation. Councilor Frank Baker to my left, Councilor Michelle Wu also to my left, Councilor Josh Zakin off to my right. And I'm going to recognize Councilor Flaherty for first line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Brian. Longest serving city councilor here. I've been through a lot of hearings on the BRA and have been in front of a lot of BRA directors, and we've had some real buttes. You're not one of them, Brian. So you're smart, you're honest, you're accessible, you work hard to address the issues and concerns of councilors and our constituents in an effort to continue to do your role as the director of the BRA and move our city forward, at the same time mitigating community concerns. So that continues to be a breath of fresh air on this body. Just conferring with my colleague, Councilor Wu, in terms of the regular reporting around urban renewal, things like that. That stuff had never been done before. There was sort of this, I guess, fear of folks from the 9th floor coming down to the 5th floor to have a conversation, answer some questions, offer some insight, which is healthy for government, it's healthy for our city, it's healthy for the development process in the city. So for that end, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your time and talents.
Thank you, Councilor.
Look forward to continuing working together, as well as your team, folks that you have here at the desk. I mean, behind you, Mike Christopher probably sleeps with one eye open, constantly, responsive. He'll tell you himself, if I don't tell you, it's 24/7, and it's literally early mornings, it's late nights, it's Sundays. So great positive reflection for his role on behalf of the BRA as well. Just willing to dive into details, doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. which again, in my line of work, you appreciate that because when you're at the coffee shop or out at the ball field with your kids, you get confronted and asked questions, and you literally can go right to your cell phone and you can reach out to a guy like Mike Christopher, and he takes the call and gets back to you in a prompt, appropriate fashion. So I'm appreciative of that. And also, as we're starting to see the Ray Flynn Marine Industrial Park transform, that's in large part to the great work that Ed O'Donnell's doing out there, sort of keeping the traffic flowing and the ships running on time, but respecting the flavor of the Marine Industrial Park, at the same time opening up for some new ideas and some new vision that kind of complement what's going on down there. So Ed with his team, I see Larry Mamouli's here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least give a shout out to Rich McGinnis. He's had a front row seat to this, as has Heather Campesano. So you get great, you surround yourself with great people that are working extremely hard, and it's a pleasure to work with them. I want to talk about, I guess, a couple issues, really more on the inspectional service zoning board side than it is with you guys, but the frustration we hear from our constituents when a matter gets deferred. So you guys are going through your process, and then a matter will get deferred at the Zoning Board of Appeals, but then there's no mechanism by which the direct abutters are notified. It's kind of left up to them to kind of sniff it out. So our efforts to try to create some more accountability around that and create additional notices. So any support that you or the BPDA can give to that, I think it makes sense. It's only fair and reasonable that if someone comes up here moving forward with a project, that the direct abutters get a second notice, and for some reason that doesn't happen. They get the first notice, and then it becomes sort of hocus pocus, and people get cute. And on the development side of the house, trying to maybe catch people not paying attention. And I think that's just a huge service, because then there's the perception that the cake is baked, the fix is in type of thing. And I think that would go a long way in at least giving people their opportunity to be heard, whether they support the project or oppose the project. So we need to do a better job of noticing abutters on deferrals, and anything you could, any assistance that you can lend at your perch.
Sure, thank you, Councillor. And as you may know, as you pointed out, the ZBA is not an instrumentality of the BPDA, but we work very closely with them. We have staff that interact with the ZBA, both informally on a day-to-day basis, but also when it's time for formal proceedings, we always have a presence there. So we're certainly happy to add our voice to the effort. This was brought to my attention fairly recently, that while the due process protections appear to be there and effective for that first bite at the apple, when things are deferred and require multiple visits to the ZBA, that sometimes there are glitches, or at least it is not necessarily consistent that abutters are notified of the subsequent secondary and maybe even third proceeding. So the due process loses its effect if it only applies to a piece of the process as opposed to the entirety of it. So we appreciate the sentiment and the concern.
And then you had, from the onset, you talked about Boston being in the midst of its biggest building boom. And I've often stated that obviously Boston, we're not New York, we're not Chicago, we're not LA. So from your vantage point in terms of moving the city forward and tapping into sort of the growth and the investment, but also sort of buttressing that with the quaintness, I guess, of our city and our neighborhoods, as well as our aging infrastructure and aging transportation system. So not sure whether or not, I guess I'd like to get your opinion on at what point does a neighborhood or does our city reach a saturation point where it's like, we're sort of busting at the seams and we're good. We'd love to have more, but we can't. We just can't absorb it. And I just don't know what metrics you or your team are sort of analyzing right now to say whether or not, one neighborhood is sort of has had enough and endured enough. Let's focus our energy and efforts, push some of that development somewhere else, or maybe even as a city as a whole. At what point have we kind of maxed out?
Sure.
I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
So, obviously there's a lot of subjectivity in that. It's hard to sort of quantify when the existing physical infrastructure, the built environment, the manner in which people move around the city, when that reaches its maximum capacity. So there's a heavy element of subjectivity, but the city is, as you point out, it's a small city. It's about 45 square miles if you look at the terra firma, not including Watershed out in Boston Harbor, but it's 45 square miles, and that's a pretty tight piece of geography. It also happens to be the exact same size landmass of the city of Barcelona. Barcelona has 1.4 million people living in 45 square miles. City of Boston has 672,000 people living in 45 square miles. Don't get me wrong, I am not advocating for Barcelona-esque growth in the city's population, but I think in that spectrum, many people would argue Barcelona is a lovely place to live and a lovely place to visit. That we're not talking about Barcelona population, though. We're talking about 672,000 increasing at a fairly healthy rate annually, as it has done for the past 6 or 7 years. We're adding about 8,000 or 9,000 people a year to the city's population. That's brisk growth for our city historically. Last time we saw growth like that was at the turn of the 20th century, around 1910 to 1920, when all the two-fams and three-deckers started erupting all over the city's neighborhoods to accommodate the growth in the population. So we've experienced things like this before. Granted, 100 years ago, we were dealing with less of a built environment. Now we're adding to an already fairly robust built environment. But by the end of World War II, there were 800,000 people living in Boston. 800,000, still a significant number above where we're at today. So we believe that Boston can accommodate this, the population that we have, as well as modest growth in the population going forward. We've been there before, we've done it before. It remained a healthy city by mid-century, but as you all know, the city's population began to drop precipitously from 1950 to 1980. We lost a third of our population. You talk about a population problem, I think that's a real population problem. We're concerned about whether or not we can manage the growth that we're seeing every year, 8,000 to 9,000 people a year. I'll tell you, a really, really sad city is a city, though, that loses its population, a third of it, over 30 years. We are arguably in an enviable situation where we're wrestling with the challenge of a growing population, and that growing population speaks to the fact that the city is healthy and thriving. People are moving here because they want to be here. They recognize that this is a very high-quality place to live, both with regard to city services, the job opportunities here, the recreational opportunities, the opportunities to connect with other people and socialize and work in a meaningful fashion with others that is edifying, both individually and to the community. So we're growing, and in some neighborhoods are growing faster than others, but really the growth is pretty pervasive. And I know in your home neighborhood, Councilor, the South Boston has got numbers that are frankly greater than just about everywhere else in the city with regard to the sheer volume of new development. And it's up to us to, again, look at the fact that we have been able to accommodate populations like this before, bigger populations, and that it's up to us to work, not just, I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the work we do with other city agencies to make sure that, hey, we're looking at height, density, use of a building, but we got to make sure that all of the impacts at that site and throughout our neighborhoods are mitigated and don't render life a congested nightmare. And that means not just working with city agencies, but working with the MBTA and the state, and we do that very closely. I think that almost everywhere you look, we can manage population growth, but I'd say the single greatest factor in managing population growth is managing transportation. If we could solve for the problem of mobility, we can manage significant population growth, but it's all about mobility. You take away the fears people have about being able to get around their neighborhood or to get from their neighborhood to downtown and back. If we can address that and mitigate the effects of significant population growth as it relates to mobility, we'll be in much better shape. And I think we're doing that. Obviously, there's a whole lot of people who think we're not doing it fast enough, making the accommodations that need to be made by a growing Boston, but we're working really closely internally in this building, but also with our compatriots up at Beacon Hill and in the state bureaucracies to make sure that we're dealing with mobility solutions that again, address the needs of a growing city. So again, it's a subjective call, not an objective. We get that there's an objective problem, but the methodologies by which we address it are painstaking and expensive and take
Councilor
time.
Flaherty?
And I appreciate that. And obviously, the mobility was issues that we addressed this week. Traffic, and particularly yesterday's hearing, EMS response times are up. Just police and fire response times are up because they just can't get to and from. And we're also hearing from folks in the commercial real estate world that are talking about not renewing their leases because their employees are having a hard time getting in and out of parts of the city. So obviously, significant issues that we're grappling with. And as much of a focus that we put on the affordable housing crisis, hopefully the focus will be on, particularly on the mitigation side, on large-scale developments that they're stepping up to the plate and they're creating putting in some private investment to create transportation solutions for the greater good.
We absolutely must leverage private development to yield benefits on transportation. We talk about it a lot, as you know, over in the seaport. The seaport is growing at a really robust pace. And both the commercial activity and increasingly now residential, putting more people on the streets, getting in and out of the seaport, over the Mokeley Bridge. Northern Avenue Bridge is still down, but not down for the count. As you know, the budget that's before you contemplates significant new funding for the Northern Avenue Bridge. So we're investing in the infrastructure. We're investing and working with the state on MBTA solutions and also exploring some other very innovative approaches to moving people around congested downtown. But, you know, from a planning standpoint, we take this stuff really to heart. It's not just a one-off, oh, here's a big building, let's see what we can get from the developer to help support planning or maybe even physical improvements in the MBTA. We commissioned and invested heavily in Imagine 2030, which is our general citywide plan, which was completed last year. And a component piece of that was Go Boston. And Go Boston was led by the BTD, but again, it looked at mobility issues throughout the city, not just in the core downtown. So we are animated in every development project that comes before us with an eye toward Go Boston and Imagine Boston 2030, those really important planning documents, and making sure we adopt some ways and means by which we can achieve the goals in both of those planning documents. So we've done significant planning on mobility to deal with population growth and development growth. The real challenge here is the dollars and cents associated with implementing these fixes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome everybody from the BPDA. As Councilor Flaherty said, thank you, Brian, for everything you do. Your city to the service as well as service as well as the service to the nation. I appreciate that so much. And I generally deal with Mike Christopher and John Greeley, so I'll give them both shout outs. They're always immediate with a phone call or a text, an email. And, you know, we have not quite the waterfront, but in my hometown of Reedville, a little section in Hyde Park that I love. We have, you know, I appreciate the fact that you did the walkthrough with us. So even you were down Industrial Road looking around saying, oh my God, I had no idea there was this much property down here. There is. And I'm going to be relying on you and your guidance and your staff's guidance heavily over the next couple years, at least a couple years anyway, about the development and how to make sure that development is done properly. And I know that we've got a lot of issues down there with Sprague Street and now 1725 Hyde Park Ave seem to pop back up again, and there's a lot of concern down there. So you and your staff greatly appreciated the work that you've done, and I know that that project continues to kind of grind along, so we'll see where we're at with that. The $163 million that you mentioned for Millennium Tower, affordable open space. Do we have anything in the pipeline? Any thoughts, or is that how is that actually going to happen? You get the check. Where does that? What's the process? Sure.
So very simply, with the project's approval, when the project pulls building permits, it will trigger a payment of $102 million to the city of Boston. Now that the bulk of that $102 million has been spec'd out. It's been the recipients of those revenues have fundamentally been identified through the sort of statements of priority by the mayor of Boston. As you may recall, the $102 million is going to be used to make improvements to Boston Common that are probably a century or more past due. So Boston Common benefits, Franklin Park benefits from historic investment in improvements, and affordable housing developments in both East Boston and South Boston will benefit from that revenue. So it's going to go, now the money, the requirement to pay is triggered with ultimate issuance of the permit, but the actual spending of that money will take multiple years, given that all of these projects are phased over a significant period of time. But the city actually will take custody, will receive the money shortly. The second tranche is what we anticipate to be about $61 million additional dollars. Those dollars are paid as sales occur of the condominiums. They were tied to condominium sales. As you know, this is a significant residential development as well as commercial. And as condominiums are sold, a per square foot payment is required by the development and the owner to the city. So the second $61 million comes in over time as units are sold. In addition, there is an affordable housing requirement, a significant affordable housing requirement required for a residential development of this size. That will be used, first of all, the developer expects to satisfy that obligation by creating off-site affordable housing in the immediate vicinity, likely Chinatown. And there is another affordable housing revenue source in addition to the requirement to create units off-site, several dozen units off-site. There will be a $4 million IDP payment made by the developer as well. That's $4 million that the Department of Neighborhood Development can use for the creation of affordable housing to be contemplated at a later date.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor.
Councilor Sabi George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here today. I have a few questions regarding the IAG process, which is often the spot where our community, our residents, our civic associations interact most directly with the BPDA, and in particular, the mitigation of the community benefits packages that are developed in partnership between the IAG, the developer, and your staff from the BPDA. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Because there are always some questions about the clarity of the process or the direction of the process.
Sure, and there's no question. We think that the process has served the city well for much of its history, but not without significant criticisms. And at the beginning of Mayor Walsh's second term, we're very actively thinking about how we can go about improving the current reality, both as far as the role of an IAG. That's an important consideration we're wrestling with. What is it that the IAG is supposed to do versus what it is that an IAG may be doing? They may not be the same thing. And then second...
And I think they may not be the same thing project by project.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And getting orthodox consistency in how IAGs behave and understanding their role and then focusing, staying in a narrow lane of that role has often been a challenge, because we are, after all, dealing with individual human beings who see things differently, see their role differently, or want their role to be something other than what they may be informed their role is. So simply put, the IAGs were a creature of the prior administration. The prior administration wanted to create a vehicle by which, most developers go out and visit with individuals, they visit with electeds, they visit with civic associations to garner support, get feedback, and mitigate impacts of the proposed project before they advance toward consideration by the BPDA board. Sometimes historically there was a concern that did not have a cohesive sort of central point to address and harmonize requests for mitigation. So the IAGs were created by the prior administration for a very specific purpose. What are the effects of a project and how should it be mitigated? Seeking consensus through a variety of stakeholders in the neighborhood. And the policy that was created focused on, first of all, your role is mitigating impacts of proposed projects. And then a mechanism to select was created by which the mayor's office identified individuals in affected neighborhoods to sit on the IAGs, and every elected official who represented a piece of that neighborhood would also have the opportunity to nominate members of the IAG. The reality is sometimes electeds don't nominate anyone. Sometimes electeds have a whole lot of people they want to put on. Sometimes electeds want to put the exact same people on over and over again because they trust their judgment. They know that they have respect and support in the community for the way in which they approach development decisions. So each IAG is comprised of different people as a general rule, but they're ultimately the selections of the local electeds, and including the mayor of Boston. So the agency, turns toward local, both city and state elected officials to help us identify people to perform this duty of mitigating. Now, the reality is the IAGs very often sprawl. There's a mission creep. Instead of focusing on, well, here's the projects that's been discussed throughout the neighborhood, through BPDA meetings, through meetings maybe that were not BPDA sponsored but hosted by the developer. Here are the sentiments that would derive from a variety of neighborhood organizational visits. That you'll have a whole lot of inputs. And I think the notion was the developer works with the community broadly to gain support for the project, but then mitigation is the role of the IAG. When it comes to mitigation, that's where the IAG's role really kicks in. I think it's safe to say that very often the IAG looks at the whole project. It is functioning as a civic group in a sense. In addition to mitigation, they're looking at the merits of the project, period. And so that, again, that gets difficult trying to harness and corral the IAG so that it focuses on its true mission. So we're wrestling with things. What do we really want the IAG to do? Do we want to continue to restrict it to mitigation? Do we want it to be a broader function? And so once we resolve that, the question then becomes, how do we make the selections? I think we've been loath to think about eviscerating the role of the city council or state reps or state senators. The notion of sort of taking that role away from you all concerns me greatly. I mean, people have suggested it. Maybe there are too many people appointing the same people. Maybe electeds like a certain number of people and you need to break it up, fresh blood, that kind of thing. We're wrestling with this because we think this mechanism has given you a voice. Each of you, as well as your colleagues at the State House, has given you a voice in the composition of these organizations, these IAGs, and therefore you, through them, have input. You trust their judgment, and you've sent them our way. So we really need to have a conversation with you all that focuses on, do we have the right people doing this job? And by the way, what is the job we want them to do? I think, again, the beginning of the second term of the mayor, it's time to wrestle with that question once again. But I'm sorry, Council, we don't have an answer yet. We agree that there are problems with this, but we don't know how the story ends yet or what direction we should be going in 2018.
Well, I think it's important enough to hear, at least for today, that mitigation is the role of the IAG, at the very least, at the core of what they do.
It is. It's the stated goal of the IAG in the policy that was adopted by the prior administration, but has been fundamentally reiterated by this administration. The goal is mitigation, but there's no question.
But I think then that we need to make sure that as we empower IAGs to do this work, that they're fully aware of their charge. And I get that that mission creep, I think that's a great way to describe it, and it sort of goes into some of the other work. But I think that those two things go hand in hand, because how the project is developed does impact the community.
No
and then
question.
deciding, those impacts, if we can lessen the development's impact, then are we lessening the mitigation on the other end? But I think it's really important, because we do hear from IAGs across the city as an at-large counselor that there are sometimes some discrepancies between or sort of what one neighborhood feels it's getting versus another one. But then also a second problem, I think an equal problem, is an IAG will go into a project, come up with an agreement for mitigation or community benefit, and then it gets changed, or there's a feeling that it gets changed along the way. And I think that we need to be more clear and transparent about any potential changes to a mitigation agreement that an IAG comes up with, that an IAG presents. So I have a specific project that's come up on, and I'll talk to you about that online. I think it's important to have that higher level conversation, or at least statement about the role of the IAG.
Thanks very much
you.
for your input, Councillor. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. Thank you, Director Golden. Director Golden, I was down at the South Boston waterfront today. I know you were down there, and one of the most significant developments I've seen down there in many years was the ground opening of the Omni Hotel. And what was significant about it was women-owned, minority-owned, finance, construction. I thought it was great for the city, great for these companies. They're hardworking, they're very professional. So I wanted to thank the city, thank the state and BPDA. So it was a significant development. I'd love to see more of that taking place, not just down at the South Boston waterfront, but across the city as well. I know you're committed to that also. Any thoughts about that?
Absolutely, Councillor. And sort of picking up on the Massport theme, after Massport issued the RFP that resulted in the designation of Omni as developer of, I think, what's the third largest hotel in the city now, we broke ground. The council is referencing a groundbreaking this morning. It's right across the street from the convention center in the Seaport. Tremendously exciting from a just bricks and mortar development standpoint, and the ability of this project to serve the needs of not just the convention center, but the needs of the hospitality industry and all those who benefit from significant tourism in Boston. We have an undersupply of hotel rooms. We have a significant undersupply of hotel rooms in the Seaport. So this hotel that we broke ground on this morning is going to go a long way toward addressing that room shortage. But very importantly is sort of the social and economic justice goals that you referenced this morning that are sort of embodied in the decision to grant the designation to this developer. Again, significant minority and women business participation in the development team. And so when Massport, around the same time Massport was issuing that RFP and granting the designation to the current developer, we shortly thereafter issued an RFP for Parcel 12, which is a significant parcel, an old urban renewal parcel owned by the Boston Planning and Development Agency that has historically been used as a parking lot on Tremont Street in Chinatown next to the Wang Center and Tufts Hospital. We put out an RFP in seeking mixed-use development, significant residential development with large numbers of affordable units. That was That was a really meaningful goal, but we also had language in there, not the identical language to Massport, but we had language in our RFP which required those seeking designation as developer to come tell us what they were going to do to aggressively pursue minority participation and participation by women in the project as part of the development team and as beneficiaries of the success of the development. So we have a team that responded with significant component pieces that react to our expectation that there be solid outreach to communities that in this city have traditionally not benefited from this very robust development climate. So we think that we have a very similar story in the making at Parcel 12, which I believe is in your district as well.
Yes.
I think it bears a significant resemblance to what we saw at the Seaport with this hotel. And we are committed to insisting that when it comes especially to land that we own, you know, most of what we do is regulate private development on private land. But there are instances where we actually designate a developer on public land. So especially when it's land that this agency owns, we feel it's important for us to identify goals of economic inclusion and seek participation in the project and the benefits that flow from the project for a variety of people who again traditionally do not benefit. And frankly, that is usually minority businesses, minority investors, and women-owned businesses and investors.
Thank you. And
thanks, Councillor.
yeah, and one other issue. I know you highlighted Chinatown. Another significant development I've seen in Boston over 30, 40 years was the, thanks to the mayor, was the location of a public library in Chinatown, and thanks to the BPDA staff as well. I know it's only temporary, but I do know you are committed to building a permanent library in Chinatown. I know that's going to be significant. It's going to help the community very well. I was down at the library a couple weeks ago. It's doing great. The Urban College is great.
Right.
They're helping a lot of people. Any thoughts about what the next stage is in terms of a public library?
Sure. So we're terrifically excited about being the host and the landlord of the Chinatown Library Services, which again are at 2 Boylston Street in a building that this agency owns and we acquired from the city of Boston in the early 1990s. So that building is full of life. As you identify, it hosts the Urban College, which provides higher ed opportunities to populations that tend not to have an easy time accessing it in this city. It hosts the International Institute, which primarily provides education to hundreds of immigrants. We're talking first-generation new arrivals here in Boston who would not have easy access to such services. I've been to both. These are thriving, and they hold a lot of promise for the people who benefit from their programs. It's a path forward in life that we're proud to play a role in by owning a facility and leasing the places to those significant educational organizations. But the library, we believe that should get much bigger and have a permanent home in the long run. But because it has been missing for 50 years, thought that in response to both the request made of us by Mayor Walsh and by the demands of the neighborhood, people wanted this returned for the first time in half a century. So we've started. And you're right, it's a thriving small library, a buzzing beehive of activity, and we're going to find, we expect it to be there for a few years. We're happy to have it there as long as it desires to be there, but we're going to find a bigger bona fide branch library for Chinatown in the near term, and some of the developments that are going through our process right now are likely to yield that. Again, back to parcel 12, the developer has very publicly stated that a home for the library, permanent home for the library in the parcel 12 development proposal that we're now looking at and examining could be feasible. So we expect sooner or later to have a permanent facility, a much grander facility located in Chinatown.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great addition to the community. I see elderly grandparents taking their grandkids to the library, and they're reading in Cantonese and they're reading in Mandarin, and it's great for the community. It's a great way to spend quality time with each other as well as a family. The other issue I had, can you talk about the Mass Pike Towers? I know there's some ongoing issues as it relates to the tenants and the ownership, but I would never want to see a tenant be kicked out of that location. There's a lot of immigrants there. There's a lot of low-income families there. They've been in Boston for a lot of years. Do you have any updates on what's happening at the Mass Pike Towers?
So very briefly, because I do not want to give you detailed information that is inaccurate, and I think that the best way for me to approach your question is to bring staff down and have a visit about the particular nature of the affordability there and what the mechanism is by which affordability is required. I believe that is a development where affordable units are protected for a certain period of time, and that when the requirement for that protection expires, that the landlord could move these units to market rate units. We've had some significant successes. When I say we, I'm not just talking the BPDA, I'm talking the city, and sometimes involving our state partners in getting involved in those projects so that before affordable units convert to market rate units, we can head off that threat. And in some cases by extending affordability through a variety of financing mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Usually what happens is, and this does pop up very frequently throughout the city, there were mortgages issued, many decades ago, or financing provided for these projects decades ago that required the affordability for a specific period of time, not perpetuity, and that's the problem. The protections are often not perpetual, so when they come to the end of the mandatory affordability period, we have to race to get ahead of the problem and are headed off so that we don't see the kind of displacement that you're referencing. I know that the challenge of maintaining affordability at the development that you just referenced is very well understood in City Hall by both Mayor Walsh, the Department of Neighborhood Development, and I know we have folks in our agency who work on affordable housing issues who are more familiar with the specifics of the financing and the potential for the displacement. So we're on it, and we'll visit with you.
No, thank you. I think that's an important issue, and I'm 100% with the tenants on that issue. And just as it relates to South Boston, are there any plans for new zoning procedures for South Boston? I know what neighbors do want. They'd love to see a minimum lot size in the community, in the neighborhood. I know it was rezoned several years ago, but what's the latest on that?
Sure. So it was, as you point out, Councilor, it was. There's been a lot of planning and rezoning in South Boston in recent years. You can go back maybe over a decade. Look at East First. The zoning that was adopted over there. It was more specific nodes of South Boston. We've got a planning study that was just completed about a year ago over in Dorchester Avenue. But in the past couple of years, there was a rezoning effort for South Boston proper, which was the bulk of what we all understand today as the traditional neighborhood of South Boston, not the Seaport, not necessarily the newly zoned East First Street corridor or Dorchester Ave, but the residential geography of the city, of the neighborhood. That a rezoning effort occurred, there were some unforeseen impacts to that rezoning effort that caused the community some significant consternation. And we have basically put an iPod in place so that we can continue to look at the effects, some of them unintended, associated with the new zoning, so that we can get some of these wrinkles out of it before we revert back to the new zoning. Yes, we've done new zoning, but we have an iPod in place, an overlay district that allows us to continue to review the effects of the new zoning. Hopefully we can remove that iPod and return the area to the vision we had for zoning as of right. But because some of the zoning as of right caused some concerns, we put the overlay district in so that we could continue to consider it. And obviously the consideration is with serious consultation with the neighborhood.
Thank you. And do I have time for one more question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Just as it relates to the south end, I know there's some proposals on Albany Street. We also have on Albany Street some major issues with traffic, with parking. Any long-term plans on what the traffic likelihood is as it relates to development? It's tough getting in and out of there. Residents are complaining about the area, and there's major proposals going up. Just want to see what your thoughts are about the traffic.
Sure. So for the most part, we view the Harrison-Albany planning study and the zoning that flowed from it. It's a fairly recent creature, 2012, 2013. We got out into the neighborhood, did some really granular, good old-fashioned planning block by block, and worked with the neighborhood to identify density and the desired uses. And so once that plan was adopted and the zoning adopted associated with it, we have in fact seen projects come in through Article 80 seeking BPDA approval that were very much consonant with the wishes of the neighborhood. People brought in projects that were consistent with the planning and new zoning, and there's been steady build-out associated with that plan and that new zoning. The core neighborhoods are extraordinarily challenging to deal with from a transportation and a mobility standpoint. The downtown is more congested. The south end is, the seaport is, the north end is. Traffic congestion in the downtown continues to occupy a lot of our thinking. Again, development is, when people are concerned about development, I'm not saying that height and density don't legitimately vex people sometimes. When people talk about the concerns about too much development, very often it's about the congestion and the mobility issues associated with it. So again, we have spent a lot of time and resources working with Imagine 2030, with Go Boston, the BTD planning-led effort, BTD-led planning effort, to identify, whether it's through mass transit, whether it's through multimodal, bikes, pedestrian, vehicular, MBTA. We're looking at all modes associated with transportation, especially in the neighborhoods that are seeing the biggest numbers of square feet developed. And again, that is the core downtown. But it's been a challenge, frankly, since the 80s when the South End became an extraordinarily hot real estate market and real estate development market. So we take all this to heart, and we're very concerned about making sure that developers are investing in the infrastructure necessary to get the people who are going to live in those developments in the South End moving around efficiently.
Thank you, Director.
Thank you. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you for being here this afternoon. On my first round of questions, I really wanted to get a greater understanding of how you guys work and who you are, and also how, I guess, we got here. So just starting directly with your staff, how many employees work for you? I'm sorry if I missed that number.
No, sure. As of right now, I believe it's 227.
And based on, and I know this is from last year, but based on the statistics that we got, 66% are white, 16% black, 10% Asian, 60% Latino, and others 2% or two or more than one race. Is that those statistics about the same for this year?
I think there's been very little movement
no change.
in those numbers.
And of their top 10% of wage earners, 83% are white. Would that be about the same as last year?
83. I don't know what the percentage is. I'm sorry. Was that in?
This is last year,
It's in-
Okay.
based on your numbers. I
It's
don't
in
know
our
if anything's changed.
handout as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Counselor. Yes, it looks like it's 83%. If you look at the top 10% of earners, 83% are Caucasian. Yes.
And the vast majority of that are men. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, 16. Yes, sorry, 16. I'm looking at the total, regardless of
Totals not matching.
race or ethnicity. 16 males and 6 females. Yes.
Right. So I remember in your comments earlier, you had stated that part of your mission is to make sure that Boston is in. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I go into that, in your employee staff, do you have you don't have a residency requirement for the BPDA?
Do you? For the agency, we're not bound by the city's residency ordinance because the city's residency ordinance can't bind the BPDA since we're a creature of state law. But we do, as a matter of board policy, there is a policy at the agency which was passed by the agency's board requiring residency for the first 10 years of employment.
So roughly how many folks do you have live in Boston and don't?
I'll have to get back to you on that number, but I do know this. I have seen that number in fairly recent history. The vast majority live in the city, and regardless of whether they're bound by the residency requirement or not. There are a whole lot of people who have timed out, they passed the 10-year mark, but continue to live in the city. The numbers are very high.
When you get those numbers to me, could you also get me where they're living in the city?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Because when you had mentioned that the part of the goal is to make sure that this continues to be an inclusive city, one of the biggest concerns I have is when you see an agency that is not reflective of the demographics of the city, planning the future of the city. Those communities that you're planning for are not at the table.
I would say, I don't have the breakdown here, but I'm also happy to get it. If you're talking about the agency writ large, you're right. The numbers are what the numbers are. If you're actually interested in what the planning division looks like, I think it just happens to be the case that it looks different. There are a variety, I can't begin to discern sort of the historical patterns and the reasons why people of different races may or may not be attracted to the profession that we're engaged in. But I do think it's true that if you look within the agency, division by division, you would see significant differences in composition, in racial composition of the workforce, division by division. It's roughly 10 divisions. They look very different from one to the next.
But not in your top wage earners, though.
No, I'm sorry. Those, yeah.
Yeah.
I was referencing the planning division.
And so I guess what is your plan to make sure that your agency looks more like the city of Boston?
So this conversation comes up a lot in our business. I suppose it comes up in a lot of different city agencies as well. we work really aggressively to get our staff recruitment efforts into places where we can tap into a diverse workforce. Look, a lot of our positions, we hire a lot of planners. We hire a lot of MPAs, some MBAs. We hire a lot of architects. We have engineers, people who, civil engineers with backgrounds in developing infrastructure. So we have, generally speaking, a pretty serious concrete skill set we're chasing, and we try to get to the places that have those skill sets and interview and identify ourselves as a great employer to come have meaningful work with and have a profound effect on one of the great cities of the world. So we're aggressive in our HR efforts to get in front of not just populations with the right skill sets that we need to do the work we are, but to your point, Councillor, to get a workforce that looks like the city of Boston. I think that's important. I think that is, people strive for that throughout the bureaucracy of City Hall, and we're no different. I'd love to get the numbers up, and I think we're working aggressively to do that. We've got a far more sophisticated recruiting effort in recent years at this agency when it comes to staff hiring and staff recruitment. And again, it's only been a couple years, but I would like to think we'll bear fruit in the near term. But we try to get where we need to be to tap into the skill set and a workforce that can respond to the needs of a diverse population and diverse neighborhoods.
So along that vein, and I'll, when I switch to another topic, it would be great if you come back with some concrete goals for either the numbers or the recruitment, the events that you're going to attend, the institutions that you're going to, whether you're going to HBCUs, whatever you're doing. I would love to see that as a plan, so that next year we're talking about how you've increased.
No, I think we could do that well before that.
Okay. In terms of your income, now just rough estimates, annually you make how much the agency does?
All in the revenue is about, I think it's fairly consistent between FY17 and 18, is about $62 million.
And majority of that is from the Flynn?
The Raymond L. Flynn Marine Park is where most of our resources are that generate revenue that provide the resources to run our operation. There's a significant amount as well, though, generated out of the Charlestown Navy Yard.
Right.
And then there's a variety of properties throughout the city that...
I think Sergeant's Wharf, that parking lot, at least in my district.
Sergeant's Wharf, Parcel 12, which we mentioned as a future development site for housing, that's a parking lot. We have a parking, I'm sorry? No, I'm going to get to that for sure, but I'm talking, the assets are either buildings that are leased or ground leased and parking. Those are some significant, I'd say the parking altogether is probably about, parking not including the garage at the Marine Park, at the Flynn Marine Park. There is a garage there. That's a revenue producer. Most of the people who work in the Marine Park park there. Okay. But the three lots, Sergeant's Wharf, there's a lot at Fulton Street in the north end. There's a lot at Parcel 12 and Tremont Street. I'd say they're about $3 million, probably just short of $3 million of the 62.
So it's through the ownership of land or leasing of buildings is primarily where a majority of your income comes from? The
vast majority. Okay. One significant outlier to that, though, is of the $62 million, OWD, which Trin spoke about earlier this afternoon, OWD, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, which operates as a part of the BPDA, that is an $18 million piece of the budget, and about $14 million of that is either grant funding or linkage funding, commercial linkage funding that goes to finance workforce development programs.
So of the land and buildings that you have, I know that you have the powers to buy, to sell, and you have eminent domain. And you may not have that information in front of you right now, but I would like to know how much of the land and properties that you own you've actually purchased, how much was actually part of a merger and, you know, the coming together of your agencies, and how much came to you through eminent domain.
Yeah, I'd say very little of it from eminent domain.
Would you say roughly majority was purchased, or majority was through the configuration and the coming together of your agency?
No, well, we acquired the Charlestown Navy Yard from the United States Navy, so it's acquisition from the federal government. It was for fairly short money, I think, because we essentially picked up a massive, dilapidated, toxic waste site. So we acquired that. The federal government shut down the Navy Yard and wanted to relieve itself of the obligation to operate the Navy Yard as well as to clean it up. The Marine Park was a joint Army-Navy base, which we acquired not that long after the Charlestown Navy Yard. We acquired that, all of these roughly mid-'70s. And so these were transactions in which we assumed ownership and control from the federal government.
So again, like, I know you don't have the specifics, but I'm just curious about, you know, again, how we got here, what lands and how you got them. And because I'm really particularly curious also if you have this number, I'm not sure, but how much money you've actually negotiated in terms of pilot payments for the city of Boston. Do you know that?
Well, we don't negotiate pilot
do you
payments
not
for the
help
city of Boston.
Coordinate those at all?
No.
I'm sorry, could you explain then the 121A tax, I think you brought it up, the 121A tax powers that you have? Sure,
A separate, I'm sorry, do you want me to take the pilot issue first or the 121A? 121As do have, they have a what is a pilot-like schedule associated with them, a 6A, which is a payment schedule in lieu of Chapter 59 property taxes. So if you're doing a 121A, very often what that involves, and it's jointly approved, it's approved by both the Boston Planning and Development Agency, the 121A, but also the City of Boston. City of Boston Assessor's Office generally negotiates a 6A contract, which is, instead of ad valorem property taxes based on the value of a property, like we all pay on our homes, that's Chapter 59 straight property taxes. The relief usually manifests itself in a 121A when it comes to the tax portion of the 121A, the so-called tax relief. You're not paying Chapter 59 taxes in a 121A, but you're paying a 6A contract schedule of payments. So what people like about that is the tax certainty. It's you have got for decades a schedule of payments that you know you're going to make, and that's different than what you might be paying if it was based annually on the value.
So, and that's negotiated by the
That's
BPA.
negotiated by the assessor's office with the end user.
Okay, and then my final question, I'm sorry, my first round. We're going to have a hearing about pilot payments. We're going to be discussing how agencies, including Massport, for example, pays pilot payments. And I'm curious, with the income that you're making and the lands that you have, has the BPDA ever considered making pilot payments to the city of Boston?
The BPD,
The BRA.
okay. The BPDA properties, by and large, pay pilot revenue to the city of Boston directly. So,
How much?
tens of millions of dollars. I don't know the number, but we don't track that. That's a relationship between the city of Boston and the assessor's office, I believe, primarily, maybe the treasurer. But the city negotiates and receives pilot payments from our properties, both at Marine Industrial Park and at the Charlestown Navy Yard. There's a lot of pilot money paid
That's excellent.
by our tenants to the city of Boston. But again, it's not a relationship that we're in the middle of. It's between the city and the entity that controls the property and leases it, very often in a 99-year lease.
But it's from the tenants to the city, not the BPDA to the,
No, correct.
that's what I was confused. So-
Yeah, no, the BPDA property does pay. Tenant owns 100,000 square feet of a building for 99 years. They very often have a pilot agreement with the city. They pay the taxes. They are, for all intensive purposes, the 99-year owner of the property. So
Your tenants pay, but the BPDA does not. I guess that's what I'm trying to, maybe I'm
correct.
confused.
The tenants would pay us usually a ground lease payment, and they'd pay the city a payment in lieu of taxes, or they may actually pay the city Chapter 59 taxes, which is increasingly the norm. The history of funding these properties is crazy quilt. It is complicated, but for a long period of time, the way the city derived revenue from properties at the Navy Yard and in the Marine Park was through pilot payments. Again, lease payment to the agency that owns the dirt, the ground, pay a ground lease payment to us, and you pay your taxes to the city. And for many years, that was in the form of a pilot. And, the reality is the pilot was often very advantageous to the tenant because it was a concession to lure somebody into these places where nobody wanted to be. As these properties have matured and they're downright very desirable to live and work in, obviously we don't have any residential development in the Marine Park, but there's a lovely residential neighborhood in the Navy Yard. As these properties became more mature, more desirable, and the economics, their economic viability was clear, the city began to expect that the pilots, when they were near expiration, would give way toward Chapter 59. So we see that on a regular basis. Pilots are going away and being replaced by Chapter 59 property taxes, which are based on value as opposed to a schedule of set specific payments.
All right, I'll wait till the next round.
Okay, thanks. Counselor Baker is gone. Counselor I'm sorry, Counselor Wu. Oh, I'm sorry, Counselor Janey. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Golden. Certainly appreciate the questions and comments by my colleague, Counselor Edwards, around the diversity of your team, and the earlier comments by Counselor Flynn. You mentioned earlier having a Boston that is inclusive for all, and I'm interested in understanding how you measure success and whether or not Boston is going in the right direction.
So I'd say take it from the macro and then we'll bring it down to maybe not necessarily a granular level of detail, but more detail. Our job is to drive the economy of Boston in a positive direction. That's sort of our core mission. And we do that. Our charge legislatively from 1957 forward was to grow the city's economy, grow the city's tax base. So we're doing that, and arguably in the past 5 years, we've done that maybe better than we ever have. We have record square footage of development occurring over the past 5 years that translates into tens of thousands of jobs. We look at the unemployment rate for the city of Boston, which is significantly below the unemployment rate for the state of Massachusetts, and the unemployment rate for the state of Massachusetts is significantly below the national unemployment rate. So there are some certain gross measures. The amount of economic activity underway is paying dividends for a lot of people. Now, is there a significant divide from one segment of the population to another? There absolutely is. That is objectively clear when we look at economic disparities and what the value, what the wealth, primarily based on equity and property, what the wealth of an African-American family in the city, for instance, is.
$8.
Yeah, relative to that of a Caucasian family.
$250,000.
Right. Big difference. And the way we get at that is through a variety of mechanisms. Obviously, we have limited tools at our disposal to effect macro outcomes in a fundamentally free market. So we're dealing with large market forces and trying to harness them for the greater good of people.
So, Director, I just want to kind of focus on the equity and engagement piece. So you talked about driving the economy, and we certainly have this big boom, but there are several people being left out. You point out the economic disparities and the wealth gap. I'm, really curious to how we as a city could have invested $18 billion in building a brand new neighborhood that has left so many people out. And I'm talking about the Seaport.
Sure.
And so if you could talk about what lessons you've learned from that experience, what you're doing now to try to rectify that. See, I see that as a big problem, just to be very clear. And in addition to my questions around the Seaport, I would like to kind of zone in on some of the activity that's happening in my district of District 7, and specifically Plan Dudley. You mentioned in your earlier remarks Massport, and how you were able through that RFP to do something that we have not seen in this city before, and I'd like to see more of that. And I know there's a draft RFP for Plan Dudley, and I'd like to see that have more weight. So again, coming back to the Seaport, the $18 billion that was invested in creating a brand new neighborhood that is largely segregated by race and income, what lessons have you learned? What is happening now to rectify that, and what will be done differently in other projects moving forward? Thank you.
Okay. So just to take one, when we talk about economic inequities, I do want to point out a couple things. We have some limited tools to improve the economic well-being of individuals and families in this neighborhood in a couple of key regards, and we exploit them regularly and with really profound beneficial effect. Affordable housing, 1 in 5 units in this city have some kind of deed restriction that render them affordable. A couple months ago, some HUD data was analyzed by, it was a study that was published in the Seattle Times that talked about metropolitan areas with the highest numbers of deed-restricted affordable housing. Boston's far and away ahead of all of our peers in the country at 26%. So we've got, in the metro area, 26%. We know that at a minimum, what we're permitting over the past several years is 1 in 5 have got some kind of deed restriction. And that's both with regard to affordable rentals, affordable ownership. We think that matters. We also think it matters that we're providing workforce development opportunities to 2,300 Bostonians every year through the $15 million we spend on workforce development. Again, with an eye toward how do we help people get a leg up in an economy that is robust but is not serving the interests of everybody to the same extent. So we're spending significant resources to get people the job skills that they need to compete in this very pricey economy that we're dealing with. We want to make sure, again, everybody has access to quality jobs. So we've got a good story to tell on housing. We've got a good story to tell on getting people job skills that allow them to compete in this economy. On the seaport, the concern I have, and the Boston Globe did a piece on this probably about 2 months ago, a rather extensive piece. Okay, thank you.
The Spotlight series, yeah.
Yep. So the premise is that I think that sort of pervaded that story is that we have a tool that we have not used, that we have not had the interest in using a tool that enhances the opportunities to live and work and do business in the seaport or invest in the seaport and reap the rewards of the positive development climate over there, that somehow we have a tool that we can use
Excuse me, sir, I don't mean to cut you off. I would suggest respectfully that $18 billion is a pretty big tool to leverage around creating these opportunities. And I think the example of the Massport RFP is another way of opening up the door. I really do appreciate that there is the deed-restricted housing that we have and where we are there. I think it's also important that we're looking at the middle-income housing, and even market rate has its place in Boston. I would really like to see development happen in a way that really has this mixed income use. So I get really concerned when we've created a very wealthy neighborhood and then we have concentrations of poverty in other areas of our city. I would also suggest that while it's very important to do the workforce development piece, and certainly I support that 100%, that there is talent in this city currently and talent that could be attracted from people of color who have the skills as lawyers, as architects, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think really important to reflect on this as an opportunity to grow and learn, which is why I ask these questions. It's not to try to put you on in a hot seat, but really what are we going to do now that that has happened? What are we going to do differently to make sure that we're opening up the door so that Boston truly is living up to its ideal around being an inclusive city, and that we can take the lessons and apply it through other development in our city.
I do want to say, I'm not sure whether, it seems to me you believe that we have control over the $18 billion. I'm not sure what the $18 billion
Well,
is.
let's just look at the RFP, the Massport RFP. So that is a concrete tool. And could you walk us through what, again, for folks, the 25%, the 25%, the 25%, and the 25% in terms of the weights? I know one was around diversity and...
I'm sorry, I understand generally the Massport RFP, but it wasn't our RFP.
No, I understand that, just not yours.
But I will say this, as I mentioned to Councilor Flynn, the Massport RFP had some really positive elements to it. And we've incorporated some of those approaches in the RFP that we issued for Parcel 12, again on Tremont Street in Chinatown, which calls for very aggressive outreach efforts with regard to the development team's attempt to diversify, to be inclusive, including populations that traditionally have not benefited from development activity, real estate development in the city. But what's really important, and I think what has to be borne in mind, when you look at the seaport, the vast majority of the development is private structures being built on private land. We have very limited ability to dictate terms to private entities. Massport did what we're doing fundamentally on property that it owned. Massport owns the property that the Omni Hotel broke ground on this morning. We own the property over in Chinatown at Parcel 12 on Tremont Street. That gives us more to work with. Frankly, legally and constitutionally, we have more to work with there to achieve outcomes, desired social and economic justice outcomes, than we do on private land. And I think that what has often informed this conversation about the seaport is a notion that we can dictate terms to developers on private land that we cannot dictate.
Okay, so we do have public land throughout the city. It'd be helpful to understand how we're looking at those parcels. So there is a lot of public land that we could then use
Sure, look at
these tools.
And I would just cite Winthrop Square. Winthrop Square, City of Boston parcel conveyed to us so that we could develop it and ultimately convey it to a developer. I believe, now there may be differences of opinion here, but I feel like I've heard loud and clear for about the past 2 years anyway, that the MOU that was negotiated with the city's Director of Economic Development, John Barros, and the development team really does some significant things to advance the cause of inclusion when it comes to reaping are achieving benefits from the development of public property. So I think, again, another model, come at from a different way. It was through an MOU at the time that the developer was selected, but it is frankly probably the most expensive piece of land the city of Boston will have ever sold, and one of the most significant development projects in the city's history. It is the largest building. When it's completed, it will be the largest building in the city. It's 1.65 million square feet, not the tallest, but the largest. The MOU does significant things to bring inclusion to the conversation about who benefits from the sale and the development of a City of Boston parcel.
I can appreciate that, and I know my time is running short, so I do want to make sure to switch around the Plan Dudley process. So you had mentioned that you've taken some of the Massport language and applied that to Parcel 12, is it? I think some of that language has also been incorporated in the draft RFP for Plan Dudley, which is really important. Some language around inclusion, diversity, I think is really important. The anti-displacement language is very important. But there are still concerns that residents have voiced. I'm sure you get the reports from many of the meetings that I also attend. I'm wondering if you could just speak more generally, and then I will use the second round to kind of go into more detail. But if you could give an overview of the Plan Dudley, where we are in that process, the Plan Dudley process.
Sure. As you know, both the BPDA owns some parcels in the Plan Dudley geography, as does the Department of Neighborhood Development. We are seeking to put multiple of those parcels out for redevelopment. Some of them are significant in size and scale, and others are more modest. We continue to wrestle with some of the issues involved in the language. As you may know, there's been a hot debate about good jobs language, and that is traditionally, when we have these conversations about jobs as it relates to development, is who's benefiting the work and construction. Now that conversation has gone a step further. What kind of jobs are going to be on the site when these buildings are built? And there's retail or commercial activity. What kind of jobs are they? What do they pay? What are the benefits? Who gets to benefit from them? There's some really significant legal issues tied up in that as well. How can we, once we identify a developer, continue to regulate it? Can we use it through a ground lease or through the conveyance mandate certain outcomes? So there's a legal question, but second, and almost as important, is even if some of the suggestions that are being floated with regard to the good jobs standards are believed to be legally and constitutionally sound, will they work? Will people be attracted to the development sites if they feel that their tenants are going to have to deal with wages and benefit and other kinds of restrictions and controls well into the future? So this is a brave new world. There's a lot that people are trying to accomplish. First and foremost, what's the nature of the development team? Who benefits from the development? Who builds it and who benefits as an equity stakeholder? These are opportunities to develop wealth, and we'd like to see that occur for a diverse community. And that's important, but then these follow-on questions of who gets the jobs, what will they be paid, and what is the regulatory mechanism by which we require this of a developer. It's complicated stuff. I think we aspire to, similar outcomes that we're seeing at Massport and Parcel 12 when it comes to the development team and who shares in the equity benefits of building a new development. But these other issues continue to linger, and frankly, we haven't worked them out yet. I think we feel we're close. We don't want to miss the opportunity to get these parcels developed. This remains obviously a very strong economy. We want to get going this cycle. We want to get going now. But we want to make sure we do so in a fashion that yields the benefits that I think fundamentally we all seek in a way that is legally workable and practically workable. Sometimes when we talk about these numbers that are being suggested for mandates on the new jobs that will be hosted by these new developments, we think it's going to scare people away. We're very concerned about people being scared away from these developments by onerous mandates beyond the period of construction, as long as the parcel is
I can appreciate
ground
that.
leased.
I will save the other questions that I have out of deference to my colleagues who I know have questions.
Thank you.
Mr.
Councilor
Thank you,
Chair.
Counselor.
Thank you.
Everyone. I wanted to start because the council had held a hearing on flooding a little while ago, and obviously, great concern every weather season now in Boston. So in terms of resiliency and flooding, particularly at Long Wharf, I see there's plans for some expenditures around design plans. What's the thinking around that, and what changes might be proposed?
Sure. So, Councillor, we're looking everywhere. Obviously, Long Wharf captures the public's imagination because in the early months of this year, we had multiple instances where Long Wharf was underwater and people were actually careening about in boats on Long Wharf, on Atlantic Ave and near the Greenway. So Long Wharf is historically a significant problem site, and if we're dealing with, multiple feet of sea level rise by 2070 and 2100, that's important, but we're looking all the way along the water's edge. First and foremost, what can we do to make sure that anything built there is resilient, that it can handle the rising tide, literally? And once, in Article 37 gives us a really good tool to use with that regard. Article 37 is the checklist, the resiliency checklist that seeks to ensure that these buildings can either resist or live with water. So I think as far as property that has been developed in recent years and going forward, Article 37 has been a really worthwhile and effective tool in making sure that new properties are resilient. But we also want to make sure that where possible, we get new development to assist in the creation of district-wide regional solutions. So we just completed the Downtown Municipal Harbor Plan. The state signed off on it a couple of weeks ago. And that Downtown Municipal Harbor Plan looks at the water's edge, and we're doing this in East Boston, in Charlestown, in South Boston as well, to make sure that the goals of climate-ready Boston are being reflected with every development that comes through. And again, that looks at where we can not only make individual developments resilient, but also create district-wide solutions. And that might be by raising the harbor walk at significant points where vulnerabilities exist. Christopher Columbus Park. If Christopher Columbus Park were raised, it could play a significant role in halting the advance of the harbor to the interior of downtown. The Martin Richard Park is going to play a significant role, but once strung together with other elements along Fort Point, to create a a barrier and a coping mechanism. And some of these, the nitty-gritty issues that we're looking at along Long Wharf and elsewhere, these storm traps. So stormwater, I'm sorry, the tides rise, they enter into the discharge mechanisms for groundwater in the city of Boston. They backflow into those and pop up elsewhere in the city. So it's basically a backup from the harbor. We have antiquated fixtures that should be blocking that entry of seawater into the downtown. It's a significant effort. It's not glamorous. It's not
Will that fall on BPDA or water and sewer?
So I think it's everybody. The reality is most
A lot
of
of
these.
water and sewer was saying that when they were with us, and Councilor Flynn and I have been over there a lot lately, but they're saying that a lot of those storm drains are private and that further
The majority are private. So what we're trying to do is make sure that as much development as possible that occurs there. And I know water and sewer is trying to incentivize the fixes in the private sector. And again, most of these are on private land. We're doing it with water and sewer and DPW in public land, and in using the leverage we have where it manifests itself to get this, the corrective measures adopted by private developers.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, the most important thing is developers who understand the nature of the problem will see it to their, as in their interest to fix it, because these backups are occurring in and around their properties.
Yeah. So on Long Wharf, the $50,000 expenditure, what, is that just to do a study or?
Thank you for the question. If I could add, yes, the 50,000 is really to look at the problem. It's more short-term approach, really to make sure that we have a stable platform there. At Long Wharf, we have an existing infrastructure that literally dates back to the 19th century. So the 50,000 is really to make sure that we understand what the infrastructure is and to make it stable, because it is a gateway to the harbor, out to the islands, and to so many other parts of the greater Boston area.
Okay, great. And so speaking of Article 37, that's where the Green Building Committee, the Interagency Committee comes from, the creation of that. I've been talking with a bunch of different stakeholders about the resiliency checklist and how that works, and some of the benefits, including, for example, that it ends up being more, or could be more performance focused rather than kind of mandating specific technologies that end up being outdated, but really pushing people to achieve certain outcomes in energy efficiency, et cetera. So I'm really interested in learning more about how that Green Building Committee works, who specifically sits on it, representing the BPDA and ISD, how often does it meet, are the meetings open, et cetera?
Sure. So I think the best way to handle that is probably to bring our folks down to have a conversation. We're happy to do that in any forum. I think the most important thing to keep in mind about Article 37 is it was really, a leader in the effort to regulate development with an eye toward resiliency. And initially, the development community balked, and it was viewed as another mandate. It starts out as a checklist. Tell us what you're doing to address these things. Many people would have criticized it on the non-development side, saying it didn't have sufficient teeth to require outcomes. What we have found is that most developers, it's only been around for a few years, most developers have embraced the resiliency checklist because they know it's in their interest. It protects their property and the vicinity of their property. Their investors like it because it protects the investment, and their insurers like it because it protects them against significant vulnerability.
I'd love to get, I'll work with Mike on getting a separate conversation set up on that, but just curious which specific people are on that committee?
Counselor, I can only speak to the two. We have two staff members of the BPDA who sit on that, but I can't tell you who the representatives are from other city agencies.
Got it, okay.
But if you'd like those names, I'm happy to provide you our two designees to the
Oh, sure,
the
I'd be
panel.
curious, yeah.
Okay.
Do you
It's,
know them?
yeah, it's John Delzell and Katie Peterson.
Okay. Great. Okay, and so I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that came up in other counselors' questions as well. So in terms of the 115 Winthrop Square, or the Winthrop Square Garage project, when, has it already closed? Has the sale closed? When will it close, and how much will be paid at closing to the city?
So we went through the Article 80 vote last Thursday at the BPDA board meeting. So the board unanimously approved the Article 80 project. The payment will be due upon, is it the polling of the building? Yeah, once the building permits are pulled from the Inspectional Services Department, that triggers a $102 million payment, the first tranche, and that's the money that has been identified by the mayor as supportive of the Boston Common rehabilitation effort, the Franklin Park effort, an affordable housing development improvement effort in South Boston and in East Boston. So that $102 million.
Is that where the Greenway bit comes from too? For the Greenway? that
Yes,
will be
I'm
part of that
sorry.
bid?
Yes, that too.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Lapse. And then there'll be another tranche of 60, we expect it to be about $62 million that will flow from the project directly to the city, and that will flow based on sales of units. That sum was tied toward the sale of the condominiums, and it's a per square foot rate that is paid to the city. We expect it to be about $62 million. But again, that flows as the units are sold.
Okay, and so that, when at closing, that 102, does it go into the general funds and sort of D&D's budget at that point? Or this is getting back to, a couple years ago with the MOU and all the transfer of...
Yeah, it certainly doesn't come to us.
Yeah.
I know that. So the money flows to the city, and I believe it
Got it.
goes to your general fund and is subject to the appropriation
Okay.
process, correct?
And I remember there was also some questions at that time about the fees or something that, to compensate the BPDA for work done.
Yes.
So when will that be kind of quantified?
So that was a subject of significant debate. There were concerns about whether or not the agency would end up, frankly, benefiting from too much of that revenue. So the MOU that was negotiated had very limited, it provided a very limited opportunity for the agency to recover any costs. And I believe it's a nominal sum thus far. It was, the last time I had a conversation about this, it was the reimbursements to the agency for some of the expenditures made pursuant were under $100,000. But I don't know what the number is today. Does anyone? That's right, yeah. So we believe right now the number is probably about $120,000 in reimbursements. And
I'm more curious about when it, so does it, when, at the moment of closing, that's when everything kind of gets locked in and then it gets deducted from what goes to the city?
That's right.
Oh, locked
No,
in for the board?
It's done, yeah,
Got it.
it's locked
Okay.
in. The 120 is up, but I do want to clarify something, Counselor. On the flow of the $100 million, the $100 million does apparently come through us to
Yeah.
the city, and I think it comes through us because we're still technically the owner of the
Yeah.
property.
Okay,
But
great,
it's 100% pass-through, but for this $120,000 sum.
great. And then just, I don't know if you had an update on the GE new building and what they're thinking or planning, was it, and is that tied to any of the incentives that they had gotten? I mean, it is tied, but in terms of so could you clarify some of that?
Correct. First of all, to refresh folks' memory as well as my own, GE indicated several months ago that it was going to slow down the development of its new headquarters building. However, the GE headquarters is in fact already here. They rehabilitated 2 historic wharf buildings over near Fort Point, and there's a vacant lot that was going to serve as the development site of the new headquarters building. So the headquarters is there. It is doing business out of the 2 historic structures that have been rehabilitated. I don't have any information that is any different than what was provided to the public about there. Obviously, there was a shift in the leadership of General Electric. The CEO exited, new CEO in, taking a fresh look at the decision-making and the timing of the headquarters redevelopment.
In terms of the incentives, was it tied to the development of the new building?
Of that building, I believe.
And the number of jobs that would be in that building?
Yeah, it is. That, the incentives, I believe that you're referencing the tax incentives, the GE cannot reap the benefit of that until the building, the new headquarters building is constructed and occupied.
Okay, got it, great. Okay, that's good for
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director.
Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian, 2 quick shout-outs. First to Kate Sullivan, the woman who greets every visitor to the 9th floor. I had 2 friends who got married at City Hall last week. They wanted to take a picture in front of the model room, and Kate was a wonderful ambassador for your agency.
She always is,
she
without
always is.
fail,
Indeed.
consistently.
Indeed.
A wonderful human being.
Yep, and
Thank you.
Thank you. And John Delzell has been a great partner to us as we've been working, my colleagues and I, in trying to discuss net zero carbon housing, just offering his expertise, his ideas, and I want to get to that in a minute. I just want to tick through some of these questions. First, do you track the vacancy rate in buildings that you permit?
We do not.
Would that be something that you'd have the capacity to do?
I would say that I don't think we have the capacity for that. I think what we have benefited from in that regard is the private sector. We could have a general understanding of vacancy rates by terrain, but project by project, we would get it from commercial real estate entities like most of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
It's never been presented to me.
No,
Do we look at the actual projects we permit?
Yeah.
And no.
But I think it's something that we should explore, because there is this phenomenon that where we're seeing more units, and mostly commercial, but some high-end residential as well. We're seeing more units stay vacant for longer periods of time than at any time, despite the fact that the market is so strong and the economy is so strong. So I know my colleagues and I have been working on that. Do you see, I remember speaking with you a couple months ago, I know you consult with many economists and folks. What are your sort of projections on the real estate market in Boston generally, in the year ahead?
So in the year ahead, I think we're bullish. The year ahead may be busier than what we've seen for the past 4 or 5. Oh, yes. No, I think it may be busier in the following context. Not necessarily bigger numbers coming through the door seeking approvals at the BPDA. I think it's going to be busy more generally. There is a feeling, look, I'm just looking at basic economic history at a very macro level. We're about to become the longest economic recovery since World War II. The longest economic recovery since World War II was 91 to 2001. I think it was just shy of 10 years. We're about to pass that. There's almost no scenario in which I think we could see not attaining that sort of milestone. We're going to pass a 10-year recovery. The question then becomes, how much longer does this go on? I hope it goes on much longer, but the best predictor of future behavior is often past behavior, and we just don't see them go longer than 10 years. Maybe this is different. So if that's the case, I was just out at the Urban Land Institute gathering in Detroit 2 weeks ago, which is frankly full of a lot of developers, a lot of people who do nonprofit development as well as for-profit. real estate finance folks, and public regulators, such as myself. We're out there with some of the team from the BPDA. There seems to be this consensus, and it's kind of obvious, we're at a very mature state in this economic recovery and in this cycle. So whether this all ends in 2019, 2020, or 2021, but by the way, the best guess for when you start to see the downturn nationally 2 weeks ago, again at the ULI from all the finance types, was 2020, that you might see that nationally. But there's a caveat to that. There are other places, there are parts of the country that are so hot, that are so desirable from a real estate investment standpoint, that they may not see it till significantly later. So the nation could see a downturn as a whole before a place like Boston or Seattle or San Francisco does. So I think the way we look at it is very mature state of recovery, a very mature point in this economic recovery, and that is prompting people to move very aggressively. They want to get their permitting out of the way, but more importantly, I think they want to get projects that are already permitted, funded, and underway. They want their projects complete or near complete before there is a market correction. So
I'm just cutting you off because I have to be I appreciate that. In terms of permitting, do we know the average length of time for sort of the approval of projects in terms of, I know it depends by size to spend.
Thanks, Council. It's
like 3 months for a small project, 9 months for...
right. So about 3 months for a small project and under a year to pull permits on a large project.
Okay. And there's some concern, I think I had reached out to some of your colleagues on, there's one particular project we can, if you don't know now, we can talk offline, but 1225 Center Street that's in a conservation protection sub-district. Would that call for sort of the full Article 80, even though it's a relatively small project, would it call for the Article 80
Does the
process?
conservation district trigger a full Article 80,
That's my
even if the
question, yes.
square footage? I think the answer is no.
Okay. All right.
We might have some other purview.
Okay, Corey, can follow up offline. How many affordable units do you estimate we need to come online per year to prevent displacement?
Oh, boy. That's a big one. So we're permitting at least 1 in 5 at a 1 in 5 are affordable. And that might be low income, that might be deep affordable, it might be workforce housing, middle income affordable. That does 1 in 5. First of all, that's only 1 in 5 in the past several years.
Yep.
Does that address, it addresses a piece of existing and new demand. It doesn't address by any means the entirety of the backlog of demand. If you look at this simply, the city's population is broken into 3 major economic tranches. There's about 40% of the city makes less than $60,000. That's a household income of less than $60,000. 40% of the city makes between 60 and 150, and then 20% of the city is over 150. Those are the 3 basic, and we could parse the data and split those up even more finitely, because a household income of 60 is a lot different than a household of 150, but a household income of 60,000 with one individual in that household, not as stressful as a household income of 60 with 4 people in the household. So that data only tells you so much, but addressing the needs of a population that is 40% of households below 60, I think very roughly that tells you sort of the magnitude of the demand. But here's the good news. 20% of what we permit is deed restricted into some category of affordable, but there's another 20% of what we've been permitting over the past 4 years is affordable from the standpoint of market conditions. There is, in fact, development that occurs in this city, specific developments because of the particularities, the cost of land, the cost of building, there are market conditions that allow for affordable market rates. So when we look at this, we say 20% is deed restricted, but another 20% can be handled by another 20% is affordable given market conditions without the restrictions.
And I think the mayor's talked about this in terms of, I wouldn't say trickle-down housing policy, but essentially the more you build, the less scarcity of it we will have
You're right,
in our
and
housing.
you're right. There's good faith disagreement on this,
Yeah.
but I personally, I think a lot of people in the agency, I can't speak for all 227, we don't believe the market can take care of everything, but not by a long shot, but we think the market can take care of some of this. The market is producing housing for people at different income levels. We see the $30 million luxury penthouses downstairs, but we also see more modest development in neighborhoods where the product is easier to afford. And look, so in the past 4 years, we've seen 11,000 units built, another 9,000 underway, and another 10,000 that have been approved but not yet underway. So we've roughly got 30,000 units of the mayor's 53,000 unit goal addressed in some fashion. That's a lot of units. 30,000.
I wonder if it's 50,000, sorry to cut you off, but 50,000, he wanted, the goal was 50,000
53.
units. 53,000 by 2020 or 2030?
2030.
2030, so we're more than halfway that at 2018.
We still got 12 years to go.
Yeah. Is there any concern that we may inadvertently, and it's a rather esoteric question, but is there any concern that we're going to see the market maybe harm itself because so many units are coming online so quickly?
Oh, if the market is harmed, God knows we don't want an implosion.
Of course.
We don't want, ghost towers where there are residential buildings developed with nobody in them. We're not at any risk of that. The worst case scenario, and I say this to developers all the time, if you're wrong and there isn't a market at your price point for your product, I don't think we really care. I don't think the regulator really cares. We'd love the market to get softer.
Yeah.
If a developer builds something and thinks he's going to be able to rent it or sell the condos at a higher price point than he or she is ultimately able to, good news. The prices drop, and they might even drop precipitously.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think people have this concern. Remember the last recession? I remember seeing the story of the guy who bought a penthouse in Miami, and he was in a 300-unit building, and he lived at the penthouse, and the entire apartment building was empty.
Yeah.
So he lived in the ghost tower. There were these stories of the ghost towers, the things that were built, and there ultimately was no market for them. They couldn't be sold or rented. We don't have a history of ghost towers in this city. This city is in very heavy demand, and maybe the best thing in the world is for us to have a whole lot of units that can't be rented or sold for the price that the developer originally thought they could be, and the prices soften, and a whole lot of people can get in.
I agree with that, Brian. I think we need to maybe think bigger, and this is just my personal experience. I bought my condo in Jamaica Plain in 2006. I was paying an 8.75% interest rate. I could not refinance because I was underwater for a number of years. It then came back like a lion, and I refinanced. But I worry less about the developers that build those luxury buildings as much as some of the folks, middle-income folks who are able to buy a house, and just the volatility of the market. My time is up. I neglected, when I was recognizing some of your employees, to mention Marie Mercurio, who's done a masterful job.
Wonderful. I just left Marie. She did a lot of work on the JP Rocks.
She did a great job
a
with
very
that.
challenging effort. She's a superhero.
She
and
is.
I just want to say to the other counselors, I really appreciate the kind words about staff. They're really hardworking. They're really talented. They're very, very good people, and we're so blessed to have them choosing to serve the people of Boston. I'm certainly proud to be in their company.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Before I give it off to Frank, I wanted to mention that, Trin, you have the annual report that you just put out. I would encourage all of my colleagues to read through it. There's some great things going on, and with the money that we're getting through a lot of these projects, this linkage money. And Trent, I just want to encourage the distribution of that if we haven't already. Thank you. Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming out, Brian.
Thanks,
We've been
Council.
here since 9 o'clock this morning, have we? That's what it feels like.
Seems that way.
I want to pick up on Matt's questioning there. And I get what you're talking about, that we're not, the worst case is then the developer gets less of his or her price point. But that's a little bit concerning because, like I've been saying, almost like a broken record for the last couple of weeks, is one of the first neighborhoods that turns is mine, and I'm getting ready to, in line, a couple thousand units right around us. So that, I mean, I think we do run the risk of possibly having that housing, like an apartment glut almost, just because I think if we're looking at 53,000 over 12 years, we've reached a high mark in 2. It just doesn't add up to me, and I think you know me, I'm pro-development. I want to see things built. I like what's going on in my neighborhood, and I've had all good experiences with, my IAGs and your project managers, but I do think we have to be cognizant of that, especially, in the outer lying areas, because someone that may be buying in Dorchester, in Dot Block or something like that, market corrects. Now, every bit of that's going downtown. If that corrects and they can get downtown or they can get to Southie or the South End, they're going to abandon Dorchester. So that concerns me. With that being, did you want to say something in the middle there?
Yeah, the one thing I want folks to keep in mind, I know I've actually uttered these words here before, but I think given the context of this conversation, they bear repeating. When we talk about the potential for a glut of units, whether rental or condominiums, ownership opportunities, we have to keep sort of the demographic boom in mind. This city is growing at a really significant clip with regard to population. The building boom is driven by one really important reality, a demographic boom. 1980, city's population post-World War II bottoms out. We lose a third of our population between 1950 and 1980. 800,000 people down to 550,000 people in 1980.
I remember, I was there.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I was at Latin school, but I always remember we were in this rut. Early 80s, we were always at 550, 560, never budged. And that's because we really weren't budging. 1980, we bottomed out at 550. We started adding about 1,000 to 1,500 people a year between 1980 and 2010. So in 30 years, we added 50,000 people. Over the course of 30 years, pretty anemic growth for a period that long, about 1,000, 1,500 people per year. From 2010 to 2007, we added another 55,000 people. So 50,000 people over the course of 30 years, followed by 50,000 people over the course of 6 years. That's what we're dealing with. We're
So
instead
do you
of
think that growth is going to continue that? We're going to get 7,000 or 8,000 people a year for how many
It's an
years?
excellent question, and
And how do we quantify that? How do we know that in 4 years from now, 8,000...
that it doesn't dry up.
Huh? Yeah, how do we know it's not going to dry up?
So our research department, and we're cross-checked on this. It's not just us. As you may know, we have a research department. About 80% of what they do actually is for the city, not 20% for us. But they're really talented, and they crunch numbers. That's what they do for a living. We actually, for the first time that any of us know of, we hired a demographer, a professional demographer, to assess what's the character, what are the characteristics of the current population, and what does it look like going forward? So we have a research division. It also, this same type of work occurs over at MAPC, Mass Area Planning Council, and we collaborate and try to identify what we think is a reasonable minimum as well as a maximum, but what is the consensus number we all think is coming our way by 2030? The best assessment of the future, what is yet to come, is that this population surge that we've been seeing for the past 6-7 years begins to taper off, but does not go back to like 1,500, 1,000, 2,000.
When does it taper off again, Brian?
They believe it will taper off. This is interesting. Recently, they've been thinking that looking at the rate of job creation, and again, to your point, the demography is chasing its perceived opportunity. People are coming here or staying here after they get out of college because they perceive good jobs and a good quality of life being present for them here. So that's why they're coming. To the extent we see a contraction, the creation of new jobs, you'd see those numbers, you'd expect those numbers to decline, right? Not as many people going to stay around when they get out of the graduate program at BU if they think there's a better opportunity and, frankly, in a more affordable place to live elsewhere. So we watch trends like that, what's going on in the rest of the country, what's going on here. But when you look at, frankly, Mayor Walsh's success in attracting significant new employers to Boston, people are tripping over themselves to get here, to either expand an operation here or move a headquarters here. GE's only one thing, but it was, in fact, it's the 5th largest corporation in America. And that was a signal to the rest of the world, not just the rest of the country, the rest of the world, that you should look at Boston too, and that happens all the time. We can go through a laundry list of companies that have come here or shown interest in coming here or expanding their operations because in the wake of the GE relocation. So research, both internal in the building as well as the nonprofits outside who look at demography, believe that you'll see this taper with economic, with fewer jobs being created. But a couple weeks ago, they just revised the numbers up. Our numbers were revised up. We thought it was in a taper. We're back to thinking they're going to remain pretty robust because of the relocation and the expansion of business. Just look, a couple weeks ago, whether we get HQ2 or not from Amazon, we're still in the hunt there, and I think we're a real serious player in that conversation and those deliberations by Amazon. But whether we get Amazon or not, they've already announced they're moving 2,000 people to the seaport with a distinct likelihood of a second tranche of 2,000, and that's separate and apart from HQ2. So this is chicken and the egg stuff. To the extent we continue to see job creation here, we expect to see significant demographic growth.
The population's moving to where the jobs are now.
Right.
And we're continually adding jobs? That's what you're saying? So that trend is continuing to go up?
Yes, and that's why our research division believes that the inward migration will significantly outpace the outward migration from the city, that we're still going to be looking at numbers like 6, 7, maybe even 8,000 people a year for the next several years to come.
Interesting. You had talked, I forget whose questioning it was, about rental trends, and you said you didn't necessarily have it by your buildings, but I think you said you had a sense of it by type or
vacancy. So we look at, in that we can get a certain degree just as a, as a consumer in the marketplace, we know what the commercial and residential real estate brokerage firms tell us about. You see these numbers in Banker and Tradesman and the Boston Business Journal. What's the vacancy rate, and where is it? Where are we seeing it? Mm-hmm. We don't see much of a vacancy rate residentially anywhere in the city.
But you're only dealing with you're dealing with the more like higher real estate brokers, commercial brokers. Like how do we get a sense of what the rental market's doing in the neighborhoods, in Dorchester, in Roxbury, in Hyde Park? What are we sensing there? In our traditional stock.
Actually, I'm sorry, and again, because our business is permitting new development, we don't track. The BPDA doesn't necessarily track directly the residential vacancy in the neighborhoods, but D&D does, Counselor, and the information we get on that is from D&D.
Can you get a straight answer out of them?
On that?
Yeah, because if you can get a straight answer out of them, will you give it to me? Thank you.
Point is well taken, but I will try. Thank you.
So along that, when you guys are permitting and you're dealing with big buildings, how often do developers come in and do master leases? We talk about master leases a little bit. How are they used as tools? Do the developers let you guys know that they're planning on doing a master lease, or is that something that happens after it's out of our hands.
So, I'm sorry, when you talk a master lease council, you're talking apartment building is built and an entity comes in and...
Airbnb comes in and makes an offer, 50 units in a 100-unit building. How often does that happen? Does that, like, do we know, not we, but when a developer or a project is in front of the BRA, is that a question that we asked? We asked if they're going to master lease, or that's more past when the permits are already released? And
So it's a complicated subject because our governing power on development, both residential and commercial, is Article 80. And Article 80 talks about, development of housing. It charges us with the task of vetting what is an appropriate size and density for the use of housing. Mm-hmm. And the notion of regulating what happens in that housing after it's very, very often people say, we want to make sure if it's condos, they're all owner occupied.
you can't do that.
Not really our call.
Yeah.
That's something you might want to, if you're a community activist, seek some kind of, commitment from the developer.
Yeah.
But it's not something we're going to enter into. It is not an Article 80 power that we would tell.
Is a master lease a useful financial tool?
I bet it is for certain developers, because in the instances where we've seen it, it seems to be driven by the fact that they see it as very much in their interest to lock up a few dozen units and take the uncertainty out of the renting individually, apartment by apartment. It seems to be something that certain developers find very appealing because it's one-stop shopping, maybe for dozens of units. But again, we're increasingly having this conversation in the neighborhoods, just as you are with the Airbnb ordinance that's been proposed by Mayor Walsh. So you're wrestling with the same dynamic we're wrestling with, but there's a couple of important caveats to our role when we permit a residential development. We don't really walk down that road in attempting to regulate whether or not a landlord could take several units and master lease them to a corporation, whether it's Airbnb or some other entity that wants to sort of run an operation of multiple units of short-term residential housing. We don't get involved.
Could you get involved?
I don't think, there might, I'm sure there's an argument.
Is there an opportunity for you to get involved?
First, we don't know what the enforcement mechanism of that could be. How would the BPDA, we don't have an enforcement mechanism for such a thing. Literally going to these developments and trying to identify whether or not these short-term rentals were occurring or not. It's something beyond our capacity. But second, we don't think Article 80 permits us to, through command and control, dictate that outcome. Now, neighbors may demand a concession from a developer as a condition of getting support, but it's sort of a nuanced line, isn't it? The neighbors can demand things that we can't. And
so
then,
like an IAG could definitely be involved in a conversation like that? It's illegal.
There's a fine line here between what a resident, Mike's weighing in, and I agree with him. Can we regulate this? Can we restrict a property owner's ability to lease multiple units to someone else? Whether it's frankly a family, whether it's you as an affluent person who just wants to go master lease all these, corporation, whether it's Airbnb or not, Article 80 doesn't give us that authority. You may be able to carve out authority like that through an ordinance, but Article 80 does not present us with that tool. So we may be in situations where neighbors are demanding things, and maybe that's a condition of their support that will have an effect on what happens in the public conversation with the developer. Maybe they can push a developer to make commitments, but we can't extract those commitments. That's at least our belief right now.
Okay. Trin, how are you today? Can you tell me how much we get, like, what was our take last year in your shop from development? How much did you put into the workforce development, your pot of money?
So are you talking about the entire budget or just for
Linkage,
Neighborhood Job
linkage, what
Trust?
was, yeah, you,
So annually, for Neighborhoods Jobs Trust, we get about, it depends on either the pulling of the building permit, which is the first payment of that project, or the second payment, which is the anniversary of the first payment. So it really depends. We try to work with Treasury to project out those costs. But in the last 4.5 years since I've gotten on board, the average is about 1.7 million annually for the Neighborhoods Jobs Trust. And we RFP that out as quickly as possible to get the dollars out to the communities in need. And with 1.7 million, there's approximately, we serve about 2,600 Boston residents in career pathway jobs. And we really shifted from using Neighborhoods Jobs Trust from a rapid job placement model to more career pathways that allow higher wages, employer-sponsored benefits, and tuition reimbursement or tuition-free for low-income students. And so annually, we serve about 2,600.
and who would you say, off the top of your head, and if you can't think of it, that's okay, who would probably be your largest recipient of an RFP?
It really depends. We look at actually outcomes first. So we really do more evidence-based practices and look at large job growth industries, depending for 2 to 5 years. And so if it's in construction, healthcare, if it's in the hospitality industry, which is a growth area, we like to see higher wages in that industry. So Best Core Hospitality is on that top list. We have Jewish Vocational Services on that list. We have the Urban League on that list.
Those are
We have about 15 who are high on that list,
Yeah.
but we also look at geography. So where should we be investing in the linkage? In hardest to reach neighborhoods, we invested in East Boston heavily. We also invested in Dorchester in the Roxbury area. So, the linkage dollars that we receive from high growth areas from developments, we try to reallocate that in low income neighborhoods to make it more equal.
Okay. In the one-stop career centers, where are they?
So we have 2, and they're heavily funded by the state, actually.
Okay.
Very small linkage dollars go there. One is downtown, one won the bid this year for another 3 years of operating one-stop career centers. That's Jewish Vocational Services. That's in downtown.
Okay.
Where it's conveniently located. The second one is in Roxbury. The operator is Goodwill Memorial. And that is located on 1010 Mass Ave as well.
Okay, and you stated that approximately 59% of the people coming through those doors were going out the backside with a job at 22 an hour. What are those jobs? Are they hospitality? Are they construction?
No, we found that those industries to be, so they're not necessarily Boston-based jobs. We look at all regional industry placements. So they're more in administration, education, healthcare, human services, construction. So high growth areas, there are in the hospitality industries, but not the higher wage. We found that Best Core Local 26 is the best model because of the wage progression.
Yeah.
And so we invest in that pathway.
In Local 26?
Not in Local 26, in organizations that get them in career pathway jobs. It happens to be Local 26 as a partner.
Okay.
It's not a requirement that they are a partner.
Yeah, okay. Brian, you talked about money from Millennium going to East Boston projects and a South Boston project. Is the South Boston project the Mary Ellen McCormick by any chance?
I think it is.
It's Old Colony.
Finish, yeah, it's phase 3.
Yeah, no, it's phase 3 of the Old Colony redevelopment.
Oh, okay, right.
The Mary Ellen McCormick is the subject of a different
So
rehab proposal.
Okay, so they'll be in talks with different.
Correct.
Okay, and I had one more question here. I don't see it, I can't think of it, but thank you, guys.
Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you. Hey, Brian, you mentioned earlier, you'd like to see a precipitous fall in value or pricing, either purchase pricing or rental.
I don't mean to be too cavalier about that, but I do think as the regulator, but also we have important public policy goals, which is to create a significant number of new units of housing with as much affordability as possible, and we think, the market's part of that. The more of these we build.
Absolutely. Supply and demand. We talk about that all the time.
It's a significant piece of the conversation. It must be. You can't argue with the math.
I would just caution, just thinking in those terms, is as the longest consecutively serving counselor, I was here in '08 when the bottom fell out, right? Property values went down for several years. They actually didn't start coming back until 2012. So when you say this is the longest recovery, as a homeowner, I didn't see that recovery until 2013.
You're absolutely right. And a recovery is defined just as consecutive quarters of growth. And the deal.
Right, it was very
The economy
minor.
started to grow in '09.
Right.
And nobody felt it until
That's right.
12, 13.
Right. And that's when
So
property values actually came back
Right.
to where they were probably in '06, which was probably the previous high. We were facing foreclosures. Rental prices were certainly flat and stable in my neighborhood anyway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think, on the development issue, I think that I've been a supporter of appropriate, good development. Most of the development in my neighborhood, I think, has been in underutilized, industrial, unused areas, namely Boston Landing, big Honeywell.
Yeah, where do you
vacancy.
begin?
Yeah, all over, right? I just think that we're touching nerves with people, and when you say stuff like a precipitous drop, I would just be careful, because a lot of the projects and the IAGs that I'm talking to on a regular basis, I think they might not say it out loud, but I think they are worried about their own personal property values. I think they're worried about if they're going to be able to rent their second floor, 3-bedroom, and I have always erred on the side of more development, because I think we're getting to a place where prices are stabilizing. That's what I'd like to see, stabilizing for a while, right? I had tenants upstairs, anecdotally. I charged them $1,600 for a 3-bedroom up until 2 years ago. For 5 years straight, never raised their rent. Then I creeped it up a little bit. And I think that's, an owner-occupant tends to do that. What I'm seeing now is I am seeing a softening in the market. And I think that's somewhat a good thing, softening. I don't want to see a precipitous fall, though.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of anxiety in the neighborhoods. And obviously, you know what's going on in our neighborhood. You're not only a friend, you're a constituent.
Right.
And I think that we are drawing from the same people, because we have 7 Article 80 projects going at the same time. And I know you don't have control over who files plans, but I think we really need to look at, I don't know how you do it. Legally, can you do it? I don't know. Spacing it out. People are fatigued on doing all these projects. I just got a comment letter 7 pages long, right? And I know, and let me first say that, you know, I want to echo the comments that Tim said earlier, especially about Mike Christopher and Jonathan Greeley, and you have great planners and staff. They're very responsive. Unfortunately, lately, some of the responses weren't welcomed. But, you know, I've tried to work with the BPDA in a constructive way over the years. I just think that there is just, and I don't know what the answer is, but I just think that we should look at that and understand better what people in the neighborhoods are feeling, and try to, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
And you're right. First, I appreciate the opportunity to maybe clarify my remark about the softening or precipitous drop. What I'm speaking to
I'm
is
buying a property soon.
and I'm all for it. The reality is, though, there are extremely expensive new products coming online, both rentals and condos, and if those prices dropped such that a whole lot of people, maybe in a middle income realm, not at the highest end of affluence that we see in sort of the downtown demographic, that's a good thing. I like the idea of softening prices, opening up opportunities
To that
for people
point,
who
I
otherwise.
want my sons who are in their mid-20s, making their way in life, to be able to afford to stay in Boston, and particularly maybe in Allston, Brighton. And it's absolutely
And
difficult.
but at the same time, I am not rooting for an implosion of values at my mother's house or my own house or your house.
Right.
That's not what I was getting at. I just think that a significant increase in supply will help soften prices.
Agreed.
And if the developer and the owner doesn't end up quite achieving the return they want, I mean, I want them to achieve returns so that they have an incentive to build. There's no question. That's why we're rooting
Right.
for their return. But that's not really, that's a means to an end.
Right.
Yeah, they make money, but what I care about is because they're making money, they will build product, and that's a good thing. And the more of it they build, the more opportunities there will be for the cost of units to soften a bit. Just as a bit of perspective, though, about why we think this will have an effect for the greater good, if we look at the 30,000 units that have been constructed, about 11,000 constructed, 9,000 underway, and another 10,000 that have not had a groundbreaking yet but are permitted to go, 30,000 units. When the mayor came into office in 2014, I think the number of residential units in the city was about 260,000. If anybody knows better,
I
correct me.
think Buddy Christopher said 160. Could that be somewhere in there somewhere?
Yeah, I thought it was
260,000.
The reason I thought 260 makes sense is if there is an average occupancy of about 2.4 people per unit, let's face it, occupancy of units is much smaller than it was in the 70s or the 50s. These aren't necessarily families of, 6 or 7 living in these units anymore. So if it's about 2.3 people per unit at 260,000 units, that gets us about to the population we're talking about now. So if you take 260 and add 53,000, well, you're having a profound effect on supply, and one would, I think, reasonably expect it will have some softening effect on prices.
Well, and to that point, the 53,000 units, I believe 2030 was predicated on a 750,000 population. We're almost there now.
We're at 672. Yeah, so 70,000 people more by 2030. That's probably a good estimate.
Right. Just to switch gears a little, I know you're down like 15 positions, right? They're budgeted though, so I'm looking at FY17 was 242, and then FY18 227. So are we able to fill those 15? And the reason I say that is because of all the development.
You're right. You know where we really need them? If you get into the granular detail of where the positions are necessary and where we're still chasing them is in planning. Planning's grown drastically in the past 4 years. And our director of planning, Sarah Myerson, who's been with us for about 2.5 years, is really out there looking everywhere to find people to join the agency in the planning division. With planning credentials, we need planners. And last year, as you point out, we did not attain the numbers we sought to attain at the size of the agency. We wanted to be bigger than we were, primarily because we want to build up planning. We want to do good, solid, granular community planning in the city's neighborhoods. That's what the Mayor Walsh wants. That is our goal, and we're intent on getting there. We've got about 10 planning efforts underway right now, but we had some key vacancies. Blessing and a curse, really good economy pulls people away. It's hard to hold people on public salaries often when there's a whole lot of night work, especially with regard to community planning.
Right.
So hard to hold people, both lifestyle and compensation make it a real challenge to attract people with the credentials and the skill sets we need. So we're right back at it, though. We lost some key people, and we were not able to fill some of the new vacancies that we created. We budgeted new positions, but we weren't able to fill some of those, and we lost some key people. We're just redoubling our efforts. To a point I made earlier about recruiting efforts, we've had to step up our game. You know, up until 08, 09, well through 13, people were thrilled with these kinds of public sector incomes and benefits. But with pressure, you know, unemployment is negligible. Salaries are higher, and people with these sophisticated skill sets are in high demand. So very often it's more appealing to go work for, you know, these planning consultants than it is to come in to City Hall.
Two last things. You mentioned earlier, too, that we're in desperate need of hotel rooms. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because, and I'm going to reference our Chair of Government Ops. You know, we're in the throes of trying to grapple with the, host sharing stuff. And, you know, I think we're a little short on good data, to be quite honest. I think Frank alluded to it earlier. Why can't we get vacancy rates? You talked about the demographics of people coming back in. I know that maybe not elderly, but people over 65 are one of the biggest growing demographics in the area as well, in the city. So, I'm asking, I guess, Councilor Flaherty if he thinks that they'd be of value to bring some of the researchers down from the BRA to one of our hearings to speak to demographics, vacancy rates. Buddy Christopher says we have 160,000 units. You're saying 260. I'm saying 4,000 Airbnbs, as related to 160,000 units is a lot worse than 260,000 units and how it's impacting the market. So I don't know if you think that's an idea. We're kind of searching for good data.
I feel okay about my 260,000 units of housing number. There's about 130,000 buildings in the city of Boston, and that's everything now. That's commercial, that's academic, that's institutional, that's hospital. If we were only at 160,000 units of housing, that would be about an average occupancy of 5 people, 4 to 5 people per unit.
Rental units.
That's not what's happening.
He's talking about all the approvals for South Boston on the left.
Lastly, you talked about with all the development, we need to improve our transportation, and we are limited to what we can do as a city. Even though we have leaders like Councilor Wu, especially with the MBTA. However, in Alston, Brighton, I think, Mike, you know this, this new concept, this TMA, Transportation Management Association. We have several developers paying into it. At this point in time, can we start, and I don't know what the mechanism would be, but it envisions a shuttle service. We have all of these new developments paying into it. And when can we maybe get it off the ground for a pilot?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, just briefly. So I think what a lot of that is tied to is the, to building permits. So St.
Right.
Gabriel's was the one that kind of kicked that
Yeah,
off.
right.
So what will happen is, the first phase of that is actually studying, so a TMA isn't necessarily it's a transit management, it's kind of a system, so it
Yeah.
could lead to a shuttle.
Right.
It could lead to, another significant transportation kind of investments.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of look at the area strategically, and they continue to study the area and recommend things that the city can be doing better as it relates to transportation, and actually take some of those on. So as it relates to St. Gabe's, they'll start those payments into the study, which will then kickstart looking at what we need to do, which ultimately could lead to a shuttle. So that we have started some preliminary meetings on that, because St. Gabe's has pulled their building permit on.
I was just going to say, I just got a call from John Sullivan. We're going to meet, and I'm assuming they're going to start that. And I know that, I sent my aide up there just the other day. And again, this isn't a knock on the project managers. I think they're overworked. When IAG members call me to advance their concerns at the last minute because they didn't get to communicate it, then I'm going to step in all the time. So we should look at your project manager's workload, because I think they're all, I have like 6 in my neighborhood right now, different ones. I used to have 1, Jay Rourke, that was it. So there is, a need, I think, and I think they're doing the best they can. I think the IAGs, to your point earlier, are expanding their scope, but they deserve answers if they're giving their time. So anyway, I've exceeded my time. So Councilor Flaherty's back.
And I know time is tight.
I know, I'm sorry to my friends.
Just want to do either Brian or maybe Ed or even Larry, just quick little dive on the capital. I see that particularly Dry Dock 4, develop and design a permanent close of Dry Dock 4 case in the RFMP for Pier 6 and also Black Falcon Terminal. Maybe kind of run me through what some of those are. And if I'm not mistaken, so Dry Dock 4 is the dry dock that's been sort of rumored. At one point, I think the previous administration wanted to put City Hall out there, which was asinine suggestion, but nonetheless, it still remains vacant. But we've talked about a park, we've talked about maybe a flotel. So is that the site that we're talking about? And if it is, then why aren't we waiting to find out who the suitor is and have them close it?
Relative to Dry Dock 4, it's a site that we have, the administration has invested a good deal of money over the past few years. It was a site that was damaged during the severe winter of 2014 and 2015. We need to at least to secure the site. So that's what the funds would be expended for on Dry Dock 4. On Dry Dock 6, we have made improvements all along that area. Last year, we completed the improvements on Pier 5, right along the edge of the park. So this is a continuation of our investment in the infrastructure along the waterfront. On Black Falcon Avenue, we are in the process of completing the engineering study, but this will call for a reconstruction of Black Falcon Avenue as it goes up until the cruise port, and we would expect to undertake that sometime later in this calendar year.
So Ed, when you're saying permanent close of the Dry Dock 4, we're basically taking the dry dock offline?
Yes, I'm sorry. I want to clarify. So all that's going on there is we've got to figure out a way to shut off the ocean
From coming in, right.
As you may recall, this goes back, sore subject at the agency, but when we did the snow farm some years ago, the caisson was blown out.
Right.
The caisson is the gate that keeps the ocean from coming into the dry dock, just for those that don't have to talk about caissons. And so when the caisson, we spent money to bring the caisson back in to sit back into its rightful position, but it was so badly damaged that whole apparatus is not sealed tight.
Gotcha.
So no matter what we do with 4, and that money isn't really to figure anything else, to figure anything out, but how do we get the caisson back in place so that we can seal off the ingress of the ocean? Whether or not someday that dry dock gets filled in, whether it is a development site or park, not even vaguely, being considered at this point. This is just about sealing off the water.
It's interesting, footnote is I actually recommended that site to then Commissioner Dennehy because there was nowhere to put the stuff. And I
No,
knew
it actually was the right decision.
Yeah.
It was a good place, and it was frankly, hey, it was Snowmageddon. There's all kinds of records of snow. There's, hundreds of hydrants and shopping carriages in there. By the time it's over, there's a Mount Everest worth of snow pushing against the case on it and knocked it out.
And then I'd like to reiterate, obviously, my colleague, Councilor Flynn, on the iPod overlay that we worked together on. That's paid huge dividends. Neighborhood appreciates it, and it's kind of calmed things down. Obviously, sometimes the developers, particularly ones that want to level single-family homes and put 6, 8, 10 units, they don't like it, but the neighborhood,
Thanks,
they very much
Councilor.
like it. So whatever the next steps are, quite frankly, I've gotten comments that they would like it extended indefinitely, so I think that the minimum lot size is probably a key piece to sort of moving forward on that. Want to touch base on, which I don't see here in the budget, the BAR Fund, the BAR Foundation. So they make regular contributions to the BRA for stuff. Can you outline what they've done?
I think historically that was the case. I don't know if there's any Bar Foundation money that makes its way to, it used to support a variety of planning efforts. No, as far as I know right now, Counselor, I don't think there's any Bar Foundation money making its way to BRA, BPDA planning efforts, or anything else, for that matter. There has been some in the past, though.
There has, all right, yeah, because there's been some talk that maybe not with BPDA, but maybe in other entities that they're stroking the checks, but they're also trying to help kind of
Dictate outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's an inherent conflict, and it needs to stop. So if they continue to stroke checks for the city, we appreciate the contribution, but they need to sit on the sides. They can't be dictating and helping sort of determine outcomes, if you will. I find that over the top.
I certainly
offensive.
understand the point.
And then the IAGs, I want to follow up, my colleague, Councilor Anissa Savi-George, talked about the IAGs, and just my recollection, the IAGs was an attempt to basically, it was right after the South Boston Betterment Trust around the convention center stuff blew up, and it was a way by the previous administration to try to get a control of the community process. So they instituted these impact advisory groups. But at the time, the concern was that the South Boston Betterment Trust was negotiating benefits on behalf of the community, mitigation, if you will, and that they were trying to get away from that. And did I understand correctly that the IAGs are designed to steer the mitigation? And if that's the case, I find it problematic as elected representatives working with, developers, neighborhood groups, community groups, the BPDA. I don't think we should have residents in a position where they're cutting deals at their kitchen table with developers on things that they think are important, or organizations they're part of, or foundations that they're part of, or sports teams that they coach and participate in that are getting like new uniforms and new bats and balls, and they're all of a sudden cheerleading for the developers in the community. I think that sets up a real bad situation. I think IAGs are good to direct the impacts, the height, the density, the parking, the traffic, the materials, whether it's going to be brick or it's, structural steel, glass, sort of the aesthetics of it. But when it comes to getting down to negotiating community benefits on behalf of the community, that should be in partnership, in concert with the BPDA and the elected representatives that are elected by the people to make those decisions.
Sure, we share your concerns, and we converse about this with some regularity. And I think the crucial distinction here is mitigation versus community benefits. That may be a term of art that most of us conflate, but mitigation is usually, and this is what was envisioned as the role for the IAG, is what are the effects of this project, what are the impacts, and what are the specific things we can do to mitigate those impacts. Big dense thing, are you going to do some open space, create a new park? Do you need new traffic infrastructure to manage the ingress and egress from the new development site? The nuts and bolts impacts were supposed to be addressed through an IAG. But what often happens is it becomes a conversation about so-called community benefits, which frankly, you know, the $100,000 to the Boys and Girls Club or the $100,000 to the Little League, while we may all appreciate all of that, that's the traditional community benefit. The nexus to impacts of the project is usually negligible. So what we think the IAGs need to be doing, and this is on us, is the education effort, is making sure the focus is on what are the physical impacts of the project and what can you do to lessen them, as opposed to, here's a big project, developer's going to make a lot of money, let's get some money for our favorite nonprofits. Even though I get that, I don't think that's the role of the IAG, and we need to do a better job of trying to steer that conversation.
And I agree with you, and understandably, that's sort of kind of how it plays out. Whether IAGs should follow Robert's Rules of Order or whether they should be under the open meeting law. But when you hear stories of IAG members after the meetings, meeting with developers at the local coffee shop or the next day at their kitchen table, carving out things, I find that offensive, but also problematic to the process as well as the transparency. So moving forward, and then it's also, and Mike Christopher and I have had this conversation, oftentimes it's hard to get people willing to serve. You know, you call someone up and you say, hey, you know, would you be willing to serve as my representative on the IAG? And they say, well, I thought we were friends. You know, like why would you do that to me? You know, so I think people are meetinged out across the city, and when you ask someone to serve as your representative on the IAG, it also, you have to be truthful with them. Say, oh, by the way, it's going to mean X amount of meetings, X amount of months, and you know, and it's a commitment, right? And so I think some people like the title of IAG. Once they get in 2 or 3 meetings into it, they call you, you know, every name in the book because they think, you know, you didn't do them a favor. But you trust their judgment. You know, they put the community first. They're good eyes and ears for you. So it kind of cuts both ways. But then there's other folks that they call all the time. Can I be on your IAG? Can I be on your IAG? Can you be on? So it kind of runs the gamut. But I just think that we need to take a lens on that IAG and make sure that people aren't cutting side deals. Their first 2 meetings, they're against the project, and then after they have the private meeting at their house and they get some checks cut, they're all of a sudden cheerleading for the project. That's over the top, and it happens, unfortunately. Nothing to do with you guys. It has nothing to do with us. But we find out about it third party, and it's just very distasteful. So trying to maybe kind of crank in the IAG process a little bit. You clearly want people to serve. You want them to be there for the right reasons. Hope that they're there for the right reasons, but unless there's some structure and order in Robert's Rules or open meeting law, I don't see any situation where an IAG member outside of the scope of IAG should be meeting privately with the developer that was presenting in front of them the night before or is presenting in front of them 2 nights from that. You know, I think they should be held to the same standard that we're held to.
Yeah, we have the same concern. As you may know, the IAGs are public meetings, so even though the IAG might be deliberating, you know, among themselves, the public can go and watch this. But yes, the whole notion of what happens when the meeting's over, again, this is one of these classic enforcement things. How do you stop the individual members from having
But when that
these
first
conversations?
IAG meeting happens, is there a directive from, does someone stand up and say, do they read like the rules of the do's and don'ts?
That's
You know,
a
or
good
is it just
question.
kind
Do
of
you have
like,
any-
hey, thanks for serving as an IAG, we're going to get right into the project, and you have the developer start going right down the road, or does someone stand there with a piece of paper saying, welcome, and this is what we're asking you to do?
We've definitely trained our PMs on kind of better protocols relative to IAGs, but we hear these issues consistently, and we're trying to work, you know, to get better at them.
All right, you're on, and I appreciate
But
it.
yeah, no, we do, you know, your concerns are our concerns.
Great, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Director.
Thank you, Counselor.
I missed like an hour. Can you repeat? I'm good, thank you.
Is he good?
Yeah, he is good.
All right, so I just want to follow up just on Councilor Flaherty's questions because it referenced my earlier questions today. Then where and when and who should be deciding community benefits? If we're gonna distinguish between mitigation and community benefits.
So ideally, when we consider our role under Article 80, looking at the development program and how the impacts are managed. Every alteration to the built environment has impacts. And we seek to require developers to address the impacts through mitigation commitments that are best presented to us or harmonized by the IAG. A community benefit conversation, do they occur within IAGs? I bet they do with some regularity, and that is not optimal. These should be fundamentally, the ideal way to handle it is that these conversations occur between the developer and a variety of constituencies, whether they're individuals or organizational, and they arrive at a community benefit package that is spec'd out between developer and community. We're often involved in that because there's a question about how do you memorialize the commitment, how do you enforce the commitment, and in the community that seeks these things, directs the requests and the demands to us. We understand that because, again, it's easy to blur the line between mitigation and community benefits. This is a broader political conversation, and frankly, we need help in this regard. What is developed over 20 years, Article 80 has been around since 1996. So over 22 years, we've created different practices that might not be envisioned in Article 80. They might be loosely analogous to things that are in Article 80, but they're not really spec'd out as responsibility of ours in Article 80, but we end up sort of absorbing this function because communities expect us to, hey, you spell out the mitigation and you spell out the community benefits, and by the way, we blur them all together anyway, so let's just have you do it. I'm trying to move the BPDA out of that business. It doesn't necessarily address the concerns that might still exist, yours, Councilor, as well, that there will still be demands on developers from community organizations or individuals in the community as a means of developing and securing support. But I don't think community benefits is really the role we should be in. That should be between developer and neighbors and neighborhood or organizations. We should be focused on making sure the IAG talks about mitigation and that we memorialize those mitigation requirements, but that community benefits is fundamentally a political process.
So then, but when you describe it that way, we're then going into what Councilor Flaherty alluded to as problematic. So I think you've given him one answer and you've given me a slightly different answer.
No, I think...
Because he's asking to set some limitations so there aren't backroom deals cut. What you're describing to me creates a setting where only backroom deals are cut.
Oh, that may be the case, but here's the big difference is, where the South Boston Betterment Trust case, the problematic behavior that yielded the South Boston Benefit Trust case was we were empowering the thing. We are empowering the thing to do something that the court found to be inappropriate, illegitimate. My goal is to make sure the IAG is not doing anything inappropriate or illegitimate. The IAG is focused as an instrumentality of the organization. The IAG is part of what we do. It has an official function. What happens? Are the backroom deals problematic in exchange for support? I must admit, I don't like any of this. The whole notion that you cut a deal with the developer to get something for yourself, maybe you're in a butter. Say, I want you to build me a fence. I want you to build me a pool, and I won't jam you up when you go to the ZBA. All of that behavior is problematic, but it's not us. My goal is to make sure that the organization, that the government agency responsible for this is not doing that. If this is going on with neighbors, I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about free citizens in a free land, and if they want to go threaten a developer with, support or withdrawal of support because they're not getting something they want, that's problematic behavior. But it's not problematic behavior that the BPDA is engaged in. My concern is if the IAG is doing that, the BPDA is involved. The IAGs are creatures of us. But if those conversations are going on between private citizens, private organizations, and a developer, that doesn't involve us. It might be unsavory, it might be unpleasant, it might be downright morally wrong, but it's nothing that implicates us. So do I think that should be occurring? No. But my job is to make sure the agency isn't doing anything that's problematic or enabling or complicit in anything that's problematic. So I'm trying to extricate the agency from this community benefit conversation and focus on mitigation. And there might be good faith disagreements about what's a community benefit and what's mitigation. Is the park across the street mitigation for the new density you just plopped down on the other side of the road? Or is it a community benefit? There will be good faith disagreements there, but I bet we could all agree on probably with 80% overlap on what is a community benefit that really doesn't have anything to do with mitigation. Does it make sense? My job is to make sure the agency behaves correctly.
No, I understand that, but one of the challenges is if we don't identify who plays which role in this process, we create a real risk for corruption. And we either formalize the process or we do away with the process. And the other risk that we play is we then say to developers, they have no commitment to invest in the community that they're impacting. I have a problem with that. So creating an open forum and an open dialogue where community members and those community members being representatives of the electeds are having an open conversation about the financial commitment that the developer is going to have to that community, whether it's for the park or the local Boys and Girls Club or the local schools. So I think that where we have to be much clearer about what the expectation is for IAG members, I think we have to be much clearer about the role of the local elected officials, and we have to be much clearer about the role of the BPDA and the project manager in doing this work, because we've sent confusing, mixed messages to residents and IAG members, because they may be represented in an organization as opposed to actually living in the area. They come to the table thinking that they're going to work towards making this the best project it can be for that neighborhood and finding creative ways to make up for the impact it's going to have on that neighborhood. But then I think it also is important for us as electeds to also be on the same page, because I don't think that we are. Thank you.
Totally agree.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Councillor Edwards.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask a couple follow-up questions and make a suggestion. In your response to some of the questions that Councillor Janey had about the Seaport District, you noted again that you were you're tasked with being the economic engine for the city of Boston. And in that task, again, just to echo on some of the wonderful points that she made, it's clear that that economic engine or our engine is not equitable right now. And so I would love for you, or I'd love for the BPDA to make a commitment about equity in its analysis and as it's going forward. I don't know if you have a commitment to racial, looking at projects or looking at your future or the city of Boston with a racial equity lens, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to adopt one.
I'm certainly willing to have that conversation here.
Because I'm so sorry, because we're short for time.
Sure.
Great. So you're willing to have the conversation.
Yes, because I think we do it in everything that comes before us, but has it been adopted as a policy? Are we sensitive and cognizant and sort of focused on doing the best we can to remedy inequities with every planning effort that comes before us and every development that comes before us? I'd say yes, within the limited range of tools that we do. But to adopt a policy that states that, I am, I'm fine with that notion.
Thank you. So it's more than just adopting the policy, it's a real commitment to it, and I'm sure,
I understand
without a doubt,
if there's a policy adopted,
a point
it
when you
is
guys are in the room
substantive.
and you certainly are not doing or doing anything against it, but I think it's really taking the three-pronged approach. I would look at other cities such as Seattle. They have racial equity toolkits that are implemented in municipal all municipal activities, looking at their budgeting, looking at their planning, looking at their parks. So this is not an unheard of thing in terms of municipal governments taking that lens. So I would love for the BPDA to come back here next year with saying, yes, you've adopted it, and this is how you're going to incorporate it in your planning and development. Also, I just wanted to talk about IDP. I thought we were going to talk about it a little bit more, but I haven't heard very much about it. It's 13%, as I understand it right now. Do you think there's any movement or any appetite to make that larger? I know some cities have adopted IDPs as high as 20%.
Sure. So in 2014, the mayor directed the agency, but really city government generally, the D&D played part in it along with us. We contracted with external consultants that looked at what does this IDP requirement do to a developer's pro forma? Because the goal is to get the developer to build and create units, not to set a percentage so high that the developer won't build. So we commissioned external analysis, and the number that came back as not likely to choke the finances of a project was 13. I think we'd certainly have been fine going higher if we believed that that would not choke development. But for a developer to carry 13% of their units within an affordability range obviously impacts their pro forma and their ability to finance the project. So we've come to the number collectively. When I say we, I mean the administration, it's the BPDA, it's Mayor Walsh, it's the Department of Neighborhood Development, that we pushed this as far as we believed we could without disincentivizing the development of the units themselves.
Have you found in other cities that have gone higher, there's a disincentive in Cambridge or Somerville?
There might be different economics associated with it. No,
They're not that far from the city of Boston, and I think
right. I don't know if the
but...
geography tells the story.
Okay. In terms of the, I think during one of our hearings on, I think it was on resiliency, or was it, I'm sorry, it was on one of the Condor Street projects in East Boston. One of your colleagues had mentioned that there was a displacement consideration in your lottery system for the BPDA. Insert.
We're struggling to figure out what that might be that you're referencing, but we'll follow up.
We specifically asked about the favoritism or favoring folks in the neighborhood when it comes to the lottery.
I'm sorry, who was it?
I can't recall.
Someone from the agency?
Yes, certainly,
Okay.
and we were talking about the Condor Street project.
We can figure it out.
And so that somehow that was going to be a new displacement policy that you had, and you considered displacement in the lottery system. So I just wanted to follow up on that and see how that was going. I'm happy. I'm happy that you are doing that, and so it's one thing I wanted to highlight. But I guess you don't know about it.
No,
So-
it's not coming to me any.
Okay. And then finally, the East Boston Master Plan, we've talked at length, and I appreciate that conversation. I want to compliment you on that and coming and talking about that, and there'll be a hearing eventually on that, so I won't belabor those points. But when we're discussing the Little Mystic, at one point we discussed how that was your land and how, I had hoped that part of your incentive would be to free up that land for the folks in Charlestown to enjoy. But it seems that your incentive or your goal is to keep it, maintain it, and negotiate a better deal with Massport to make sure that the BPA benefits from that. And one of the questions I had was...
That's not what I said, but
I
actually
disagree with you.
I said we're at the beginning, nowhere near the end of the conversation.
No, I remember summarizing the conversation and saying that the 2 points I'm walking away with are that it's yours, you're keeping it, and that you're going to negotiate a better deal for yourselves.
Right, and what I said in that conversation was that the better deal could be financial and it could be other things. That's what I said. It could be other things. Maybe it is exactly what you suggest. I don't know, because we've just started the conversation with Massport. What I did make clear is we take Massport's concerns very seriously.
Right.
We own a couple of acres near a very significant industrial site of theirs. They manufacture automobiles. They assemble automobiles that come off vessels nearby. There's essentially an assembly facility. They use our parcel to stage cars that are going into the facility and exiting the facility. I take that very seriously because there's 500 families that benefit from that. There are 500 jobs there, and before I disrupt 500 livelihoods, we're going to think long and hard, have a conversation with Massport. We're happy to have a conversation with you, but the way I viewed that conversation, just beginning to think about it. We haven't made any decisions at all.
Right, and that the lease is up next year is great that you're starting to think about it. And more importantly, I think what the other question I had was that as you're having those conversations and negotiations, that the public would be able to be a part of that. And correct me if I'm wrong, you said no.
No, so once again, that is not. You specifically said, will the public be part of your negotiation with Massport?
Right.
Will they be part of the negotiation? And I think we followed up and said, like, literally sitting at the table as we potentially negotiate a business deal with Massport? No. We can have a public conversation. We can talk about what the community would like to see there. Okay. That's what we do for a living. But when you said, will they have a seat at the table negotiating with us and Massport, we generally don't find that that's a productive or constructive way to have a business negotiation.
Right, no, so no.
Right, not a negotiation, but community input. Had you said, would you entertain community input? Absolutely, that's what we do for a living. We're interested in what people think. And to the extent we could end up supporting Massport's desire to retain this as an industrial site, once again, we are an industrial development agency. We are a component piece of us statutorily as the Economic Development Industrial Corporation. We do industrial deals. It's part of our statutory mandate, and that means providing jobs for the people of Boston. We take it very seriously. We'll go out to the neighborhood. We'll have a conversation about whether these jobs are important, whether open space is important, and we'll listen.
Whether people
We'd be
in Boston
thrilled
are
to
actually
listen.
working in those jobs too. And how many people in Boston are actually working at those jobs as well?
I have no idea. I don't
Right.
run that company.
I haven't had 500 at all as the number.
Thank you. Councilor Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to just come back to the IDP again before going in more depth around following up some questions I had around Plan Dudley. So you just mentioned that in 2014 is the last time that it was looked at, and that it's an agreement between the mayor, D&D, and your agency?
Well, no, I'm sorry. That's who was involved in the conversation. Obviously, the mayor's a huge stakeholder in the issue, felt strongly about doing the best we could to relook this policy. The policy's been reiterated, I think, since 2000. Maybe this is the 6th iteration, maybe the 5th.
Right. And I guess I just wonder if there's an opportunity to review it once again. I think our market has changed dramatically, probably since the last time that you looked at it.
Yes.
I know the mayor has expressed interest in this earlier this year to kind of look at this. Is this the right
Correct.
amount?
Yes,
Can you tell me where we are in that
Sure.
process?
So when we adopted the new numbers in 2014, I think they took effect in
15, yeah.
Sorry. It took effect in 15. It was a protracted conversation involving consultants to get to the right numbers that would achieve the desired outcomes on creating new units. So at that time, the administration stated that it would relook it in 3 years. So we've just begun that process. We're looking at no commitments right now as far as what those numbers might turn into, or if they turn into anything at all. But we're going to look at what is our standard, what's going on out there in the economy, and can this economy handle more of a demand on developers.
Yes,
So-
I certainly would appreciate that. I
Yeah.
think it's a good time to look at that and revise that. I think we also have other models, as already stated, other neighboring towns that have up the ante there, and I would like Boston to also do that. I wanted to come back to our conversation around Plan Dudley. I certainly appreciate your earlier comments around not wanting to overreach in terms of dictating what businesses can come into our community. I do think, however, it is important that community voice is listened to around the kinds of not only businesses, but the types of jobs. It's really important that we have jobs that pay a real living wage. Now, I certainly recognize as chair of small business that we don't want to put unnecessary hardships on our small local business owners in terms of wages that they won't be able to pay employees. But I think really important to kind of continue that conversation to ensure that we're hearing not only from the voices of residents in the community, that we're also engaging our businesses, and that we can come to some sort of understanding of what would work well in particular neighborhoods. To the earlier point around tools that the city has or that your agency has, I would suggest again the RFP process. And we saw a process with Massport with an RFP that seemed to yield something beneficial in terms of minority ownership. And I think we have opportunities through D&D and through your office to do the same. And so I'm hoping, I saw again, I acknowledge and appreciate that there is language in the RFP that looks at anti-displacement, that looks at minority ownership, but I noticed that there aren't real weights to that. The same way that when Massport's RFP, that they had real weights to those 25%.
Sure.
And can you speak to that, please? Because I think to give it real teeth, we probably have to make sure that there are some weights behind the sections in the RFP.
Sure. Ed, do you want to chat about the RFP? I'm sorry, Counselor, are we talking parcel 12?
No, I'm talking Plan Dudley.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, that's not you. So there's a variety of ways of looking at this. And, what an entity that comes in with a strong message on one aspect it might be far more appealing than strong messages on another piece. And so I think the concern is allowing determinations the maximum flexibility. I think we want to get to the same result, inclusive outcomes that allow for sharing in the benefits of development for a diverse community, and that attaching percentages ultimately reduces the flexibility. It's just a philosophic concern that we might be able to weight things differently in the process. If we articulate it, we're bound because we don't know what's coming in the door. We don't know what the responses are going to look like. So the goal was to allow maximum flexibility to achieve the most desirable outcome and to try and quantify that up front. Obviously, Massport went in a different direction.
Right, and it seemed, and it had a different result, and so I guess, if we keep on the same track and don't take those lessons, then I worry that we don't get to the desired result. Let me just...
We take very seriously your comment, and maybe we should have a follow-up conversation before
helpful.
These go out the door.
I would appreciate that. I think there are questions around impact studies on transportation, environment, and displacement. Is your office looking to do that in this process, in the Plan Dudley process overall? What different projects could mean in terms of transportation? I mean, we heard that repeatedly just in this hearing alone. I know we've got a hearing that we're trying to get to, so I am wrapping up, Chair. So environment, displacement, these are just important questions. And then finally, Questions around transparency in the process. You know, I began my first round of comments with really wanting to tackle equity and engagement being a big concern, as again, I'm sure you have heard the concerns that many folks have raised, and these have been ongoing concerns about the process as things move quickly throughout our city of Boston in certain neighborhoods.
I'm sorry, is your question about engagement?
Yes, how we make our process much more transparent, that the information that residents need to make informed decisions is being put forth, that we understand what the impact will be in terms of transportation, environment, and anti-displacement. We don't want, so, you know, you mentioned earlier that Boston is booming, that many folks want to move to Boston. And I can appreciate what that does for the economy, but it is leaving many folks out of that boom. And there is a deep concern that the city of Boston is moving in such a way to accommodate those who want to come at the expense of those who are already here. And so that's what I'm responding to. And I'm hoping that we have, I guess, a process that is more open, that is more inclusive in terms of diversity and equity ownership, and one that really responds to the concerns that are being put forth by residents. And so I guess I will end here, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that and welcome the opportunity for follow-up. And since one of my other colleagues gave some praise to one of your staff, I would like to certainly highlight Stacy in your office, one of the compliance officers who does an amazing job. As you know, I monitor construction jobs to make sure that we are hitting the marks in terms of MBEs, WBEs, that the residents of Boston are getting these jobs. And she is always very professional and provides excellent data, so I certainly want to.
Stacy is indeed a wonderful person.
She
so
is.
Thank you for those kind words.
And I
We
look
really
forward to
appreciate them.
following up on these
I look
issues.
forward to getting to a conversation about all the things you just raised. I look forward to it. I think we have a very positive story to tell. I just do want to say, Plan Dudley, we're really proud of it. We think it has been a very thorough engagement effort. And I think most of the issues you just mentioned, there were at least they were a central focus of so much of what we're doing, especially with regard to displacement. And if you look at, you know, we focused heavily on the displacement issues in the J.P. Rocks planning study that we did. It was before your arrival, Councilor, but we're looking at those issues the same way with regard to the Plan Dudley project. As we have in other places. And I just say, finally, I understand the perception that that the building boom is serving more new arrivals than not, that affluent new arrivals move to Boston and the building boom is serving their interests. I'd argue that the interest that is first and foremost in our mind are folks who live in the neighborhoods, working class folks and low income folks who would otherwise have a much greater risk of being displacement. Don't get me wrong. I know displacement's a very real issue when it's occurring as we speak, but it would be a much bigger problem if we were not building new product for new Boston. Affluent new Boston arrives. If there's not new product for them to go to, the full weight of their economic power now turns into the neighborhoods. You know, the 2- and 3-decker, the lower scale developed neighborhoods, and that's where the pressure's on the existing housing stock and existing families, working class and low income families. That's where you see gentrification and displacement if there's not new product for new Bostonians to go to. So if we don't build for a growing Boston, the danger of displacement to people in existing housing is far greater.
Again, I welcome follow-up
Thank you,
conversations
Counselor.
with you.
Thank you. Last question to Councilor Wu.
60 seconds before the lights turn off and the microphone starts flashing. So my question was around expiration dates on approval. So has the BRA ever in the past, or under what circumstances would you in the future consider sort of expiring or interim set of approvals, either for a specific Article 80 or PDA or anything like that?
Sure, I understand. So your question is, At what point would we say this approval is no longer operative
Or would
because
you
of
just,
sale?
at the time of approval, say, this is good for, you have X number of years to
Yep.
shovels in, and if not, anticipating that there might be a downturn at some point?
It's a great question. It's one we haven't had to wrestle with in a long time because usually
Yeah.
what we're approving is getting built.
Yeah.
I mean, the vast majority of what we approve sees a groundbreaking fairly soon after the Article 80 approval. The last time, I think there's just an illustrative example of when we employed the threat to terminate Article 80 approvals was around 2011. And it focused on what is now Millennium Tower,
Yeah,
the old
Filene.
Filene site, big hole in the ground. So 2008 comes, Great Recession.
But it was permitted without an end date on it at first,
No,
and then it was,
Yes,
and then
we almost never,
has there ever been a time where something's been issued good for
Article,
5 years or
yeah,
anything?
Article 80 basically states if there's not progress on the project within 3 years, the BPDA, at its option, can terminate. So just to show the effectiveness of that tool, that it's already in Article
Yeah.
80, Mayor Menino at the time is very frustrated with the fact the hole in the
Yeah.
ground is
No,
there for
I remember,
3 years.
I remember the thing. Sorry, I just know we're short on time. I'm
Sorry,
really
we
sorry
sent a letter, though,
Yep.
saying Article 80 gives us the right to terminate your permits, and you got to start over again.
Yep.
Horror ensues with the developer. The developer at that time is not Millennium, it's
Fornato.
somebody else.
Yeah.
The development is sold to Millennium.
Right.
It prompted
Yeah, I remember.
some significant action,
No, that's
and
helpful.
Millennium got it going.
But have you
So
ever
the threat-
issued even like for example, PDA approvals that only last a certain amount of time, or?
I don't think so, no.
Okay.
The most recent case, I'd say in the past 10 years, the only time where we threatened termination of permitting was the Millennium Tower.
Okay.
With the site of the Millennium Tower.
Yep.
Formerly the Filene's hole in the ground.
Thank you.
But it is potentially a very effective tool, as
Thank
we
you.
saw.
Great. Thank you all very much. I'm not going to delay this any further. We have a backup here. I want to thank you, Director Golden, your entire team here, and the ninth floor. This hearing's adjourned.